Hello, everyone. Good morning to all of our, pardon me. Good morning to all of our colleagues joining from Europe, and good afternoon and good evening to all of our colleagues joining from across Australia. We are absolutely thrilled that you can join us today. I would like to start off with some housekeeping, and then I will hand over to my wonderful colleague, Brendan, who will launch us into the first keynote of the day. We'd like to request that you please keep your video and audio off during the session. We very much appreciate your support in this. There will be times when we have the Zoom breakout rooms open during the networking sessions, and we really encourage you to make sure that during these, you turn on your video and camera and participate as fully as you can. These will be a lot of fun, and we thoroughly encourage you to enjoy these to the maximum. And just a reminder that if you have any technical issues or other queries, please use the Zoom chat feature, and I will reach out to you individually to support you through these. We also encourage you to think of questions as you move through, pardon me, as you move through the session today. So don't wait until the end to ask anything of our speakers. Please feel free to pop any questions that you have into the Zoom chat at any point in time. We thoroughly recommend you to engage as fully as you can throughout the course of today. I would also like to do a practice that is done within Australia quite commonly, called the acknowledgement of country. And so I live in a community that's situated on the lands of the Darug and Tharawal First Nations people, the first peoples of Australia. I'm thankful for the nourishment, sustenance, and connection to place and space that this land brings to me and the people that I live, work, and play with. I respectfully recognize that this land was never ceded, and that our lifestyles in today's world take much and give back little to the country which gives us life. I also recognize the deep wounds that colonization has given to the First Nations people across these lands, and the importance of respecting culture and connection to country. I also recognise through this process that the Commonwealth of Australia continues to coexist on these lands. So the practice of acknowledgement of country, for those who are not familiar, is a recognition and a movement towards reconciliation with the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people who lived on these lands for tens of thousands of years before colonisation. And so with that, I'd like to pass over to Brendan McCaddy, our fabulous host for today, who will introduce our first keynote speaker. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Rosh, and thank you for the acknowledgement of country, and welcome to everybody who's here from Australia and around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I think we've got a really interesting lineup to talk about agriculture and agricultural technology in Australia. As we know, one of the things we want to do through the ConnectEO program is really talk to the cohort of small to medium enterprises who work in Earth observation about what does the agriculture industry look like in Australia. So we brought some fantastic speakers together who all have a lot to share on that topic today, and I think you'll find some real value out of it. The first, as Roshi mentioned, our keynote speaker for today, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Dave Lamb. He does a lot of work with Sturt University, and he's also the chief scientist of an organisation called the Food Agility CRC. CRC stands for Cooperative Research Centre, and it's one of those instruments which is put together by government, industry and research to help all that collaboration on particular topics. And this is about food agility and agriculture, digital technologies and how they all fit together. Dave has been in this space for a long, long time, building all sorts of different farm setups, digital and otherwise. We've done work out in remote locations, doing validation for various Earth observation pieces. So I know that Dave has a lot of knowledge and a lot of stories to tell. Dave, I will pass over to you to talk to our ConnectEO companies here about the National Agri-Food R&D landscape and the Food Agility CRC. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan and Roshni. Thank you for that wonderful welcome as well. Welcome to an acknowledgement of our First Peoples. Look, I've been around the R&D and innovation landscape for quite a while. And I'm not the only one. Brendan is another one. John Medway, another presenter. Phil Teakle, whom you'll hear later today as well. So it's probably fair to say that we not only have a bit of a sense of where the sector is today, but also where the startup and scale-up bodies are buried. And to be honest, I think when we're really talking about collaboration and business development opportunities, and let's face it, that's part of the reason that you're here, then I thought it'd be worth just offering some comments about what the landscape looks like. I've called it the R&D landscape, but really what I'm talking about here is the innovation landscape. I'm offering up our Cooperative Research Centre as an example of how things are done, but it's not the only example. And so bear that in mind. I'm not here to sell my organisation, but to sell you a trend of what's happening here in Australia, in a land where I believe you wish to innovate and offer products and services. So I'm going to assume that you don't know a huge amount about the ecosystem that I'm referring to here in Australia. Australia is ranked very poorly when it comes to inventiveness and translating of our research. Now, the fact that we're dealing with many products and services and the need for many products and services in the ag tech space in Australia, you know, we're no different to anywhere else in the world, but we are leaning heavily on international partnerships because we are finding that overseas there is much more experience when it comes to effective innovation and translation of R&D. That is not only a challenge for Australia, but it's also an immense opportunity in terms of innovators getting involved here in the country. Now, just to give you a bit of a heads up on where collaborations and research innovation collaborations really work here in Australia, we've got two main groups. We've got what we call cooperative research centres, and we have rural R&D corporations. So as Brendan mentioned in his opening comments, cooperative research centres are CRCs, are run out of the Commonwealth Department of Industry, Science and Technology. They are a partnership, a short-term or relatively short-term partnership that's established between government, research organisations and industry partnerships to deal with a particular issue or thematic area here and now. For example, we have 24 cooperative research centres in Australia, which account for just about $1 billion worth of Commonwealth funding. They are given a life of 6 to 10 years, and we've got 24 in the game at the moment, with another 5 in the pipeline that are just starting up. Of those cooperative research centres, 6 of them are considered relevant to agri-food and agri-food related innovations. So it's a relatively busy space. And again, these are partnerships between government, industry and research organisations. We also have rural R&D corporations, which are, the Commonwealth connection is through the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. These are R&D entities set up by industry themselves. For example, Cotton Research Development Corporation, Fisheries Research Development Corporation, Grains. We've also got Meat, Livestock Australia, Sugar Research, Dairy Australia, Horticulture Innovation. So these are sector-specific organisations, some of which are Commonwealth statutory bodies and others which are wholly owned by industry. But at the end of the day, they, like our cooperative research centres, offer fertile ground to validate and deploy innovations within the Australian industry context. Looking to the left, our cooperative research centres, whilst there are 30 of them now, we all sort of come together under a CRC association, single organisation. So if you're interested in understanding who's who in the CRC zoo, then I commend to you to look at the CRC association as a doorway in. Otherwise, go through the Commonwealth website and pick out CRCs of interest. When it comes to rural R&D corporations. That is effectively overseen, if I can call it that, by a central group called Agricultural Innovation Australia, AIA. And again, you can choose by going and looking for them individually by name through the Department of Ag, Water and Environment, or you can code in through Agricultural Innovation Australia, who, if you like, is that sort of organisational entity under which they all sit, especially when it comes to innovation. Now, Australia is working to a roadmap, a 2030 roadmap, which is a Commonwealth roadmap, which is aiming to grow Australian agriculture by $100 billion by 2030. And if you look at that roadmap, there are 7 themes for action: trade and export, biosecurity, stewardship, supply chain innovations, water infrastructure, innovation and research, human capital. Now, I'm mentioning that to you because each and every one of those has got, when you read between the lines, has got a strong data component. And where there's data, there's opportunity, for example, in earth observation and related innovations, even with the human capital thing. So what I'm getting at here is that there are innovation opportunities for actors from all over the world to come in and help put their shoulder to the wheel as part of fulfilling our national roadmap. Again, I commend you to read that roadmap because you will no doubt find a home for yourselves in there in terms of opportunity space. Now, another recent trend that's worth pointing out is that the way Australian research and collaboration organisations work has changed significantly in the last 5 years. Most co-invested research, development, innovation has been, until recently, waterfall in nature. That is, there's a co-invested project done, a report is generated, there is a plan or a pledge to a utilisation state, and projects deliver and are paid for on milestones, with lots of stop-go points interwoven, which are generally, and certainly in my experience, very rarely enforced. Most projects involve 2 co-investing actors, which is generally a researcher and an end user. Most of the research development corporations I alluded to in my earlier slide have a one-to-one co-investment engagement pathway. So in other words, if you want to seek investment from the Australian side, you're going to have to put skin in the game. What's now happened is that we're moving towards an agile means of project development and delivery, which I would advocate plays very nicely into your hands, because many of you who are listening, who are looking to innovate, or already startups or in the scale-up phase of your business, that's how you work anyway. Well, the good news is that our research and development innovation ecosystem is now backing projects with that very same construct in mind. Our CRC is no exception. And for example, the way we, as a cooperative research centre called Food Agility, just to remind you, work, is that when we co-invest in research, and even that language is different, we do not offer grant funding, we co-invest. That's the language that's being used by our research development corporations and our CRCs. The industry is in the driver's seat. The whole thing is predicated around a research agility model. And at the end of the day, projects start with the end in mind. And so what you will find is that in Australia, our research and innovation ecosystem doesn't look like a typical research investment body. They are collaboratives, high conviction co-investors. So if I can look at Earth observation as an example, as a case in point, with this in mind, Earth observation is a powerful tool as part of our innovation engine for Australian agri-food production when it's the start of something, not the end of it. So you'll find, and I'm cautioning you, that when it comes to bringing to Australia Earth observation on innovations, and dare I say products and solutions, that is not what we're necessarily interested in. It's the beginning of something. And if you look at the flywheel of impact, what we're looking for is to back involvement whereby the partner may want to seek some form of ROI in terms of capacity building, knowledge, the deployment of new knowledge, so in other words, in the service of product. But at the end of the day, we have end users that are looking to see something demonstrated alive. And the end user return on investment comes from a effective digital transformation. So dare I say it, but the innovation, when it's delivered, not only delivers a product and service, but also helps drive digital transformation of a business. And that's a really important role that we all have to play. So for example, and look, rather than tell you about Australian agriculture, I could be here for days doing it. Let me just give you some examples. You know, our livestock production systems in this country are constantly challenged by the fact that we are rain dependent, water dependent, and we're water dependent because it affects our feed base, and our feed base affects our carrying capacity at a given location at a given point in time. So an earth observation product and service may allow us to generate cool tools to allow us to assess remotely biomass, for example, or quality of our feed base, but until it feeds into something else that matters, a decision point around livestock management, it's only just a tool. So again, it's the connection of it that is really important. You're going to hear from Phil Teakle, one of our presenters, a little later in the program, but I'm going to use Phil as a classic example of how this thing can work. For example, we now have got capability to measure and monitor and track livestock movements over time, thanks to commercially available, market stable e-tag tracking hardware. But it's not until you bring that location data to life by adding to it, for example, indicators of feed base, such as SIBO Labs produce, that you start seeing the value in the tracking and the management of animals. In other words, we're now talking about how to optimize your livestock production system around that very important feed-based resource I mentioned to earlier. You provide an earth observation product around biomass. Again, well, where does it feed to the supply chain? So, for example, there are companies in Australia like Optiway that provide technology to allow for dynamic and live measurement of animal performance. In this particular example, weight. It's when that weight is brought to life with a knowledge of the feed base and a knowledge of the animal landscape interactions that you now have a serious intelligence tool, an enabling tool to allow producers to manage their supply chain by dealing with that very source information around, for example, biomass or feed quality. Or it could be taking that biomass and feed quality and driving it to something like rangelands carbon, and you'll hear more about that later again. So the salient point that's emerging in these previous slides here is that earth observation is the beginning, it's not the end. With the end in mind, it is the value add that goes with it. And so if the capacity to deliver that value add isn't available from the get-go, that's okay, but partner with someone who will deliver that. And that's where your opportunity lies. On-farm water demand in horticulture is another example. For example, if we can remotely monitor evapotranspiration, for example, from crops, that's just the beginning. It's when you add that to the water use profile of the crops and the water use profile of the manager that you then have the opportunity to turn it into decision point tools. And so your remote sensing data meets your climate data, meets your applied irrigation data, suddenly brings value to what that fundamental source data, which is earth observation derived data, offers. And that's again the point in case. Team up with something. Another example, Internet of Things. You know, we've got 50,000 beekeepers in Australia who all spend 80% or more of their time on the road driving to check beehives. To see health and also to harvest honey or to promote pollination services if that's what they're offering their local producers. We have on one hand the ability to monitor hives remotely to watch for indicators of colony health, but on the other hand we have these wonderful tools that can be derived from earth observation type systems to allow us to track the pollen forming in vegetation over time, to be used as a tactical tool for deploying of beehives. So in other words, there's a perfect marriage here in the waiting. But again, the point being, earth observation products is the beginning. Mix it with other innovations that are occurring on farm or in our service provision sector, and you've got a real opportunity. It's also worth mentioning that in Australia, there's a large amount of work now being done around data sharing. So for those seeking to offer products and services in an innovation ecosystem, bear in mind that the whole framework or the whole notion around who owns data, how is it shared, how is it value added, and who makes a buck out of it is absolutely front and center in our minds. And so, for example, if you're interested, one of the pieces of work that our CRC have been doing with industry, including global giants, is around best practice data sharing frameworks. So that's something you need to bear in mind. Europe is playing a major role in this, as indeed is the US. And there is a template available that you may wish to consult if you're wanting to work within the Australian ecosystem with your products and service. The other one I wanted to flag on the way out of my presentation is Agtech Finder. If you have a product and service that you're interested in offering to Australian users, then consider registering it on the Agtech Finder. It's an independent online database which has been created to help farmers and producers search, sort and compare Agtech solutions. So the website's there, agtechfinder.com. We've worked in our CRC with numerous actors in industry to get this thing put up. We don't make money out of it. It's a product or a service, a free service. There are about 300 vendors, 295 vendors listed on the site now, with about 343 individual solutions listed and about 1,400 or more unique users per month using it. So if you're interested in how to get your product or service registered, if you just go into YouTube and just search Agtech Finder, you'll find an explainer. The important thing to say here is that you really need to be seeking to or already trading in Australia to really get value out of it. Thanks. And that's all for me, Brendan and everyone. Happy to take questions.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Very much appreciated. I think there's a lot of key information in there for folks out of the ConnectEO bit and internationally looking to work more in Australia. Questions? We've got a few minutes for questions if there's some from the floor. Or perhaps post it in the chat otherwise. I might take a quick moment while people thinking there, Dave. So the way you describe the importance of partnering, so that Earth observation is the start, not necessarily the finish, and that it's really about that value creation for the end user, and that's where the partnership comes in. Any other words on that? I mean, I think you explained it really well in the in your presentation there, but I think that's fundamental, right, for building these kind of ecosystems.
Yeah, look. In my personal opinion, that's right, Brendan. Exactly. So, for example, there's the natural tendency is to go find an end user. So, go someone who'd buy my satellite-derived product or my drone-derived product, whatever it is I'm offering, and that's well-trod ground. The trouble is you're up with everybody else. The other tactic to consider, and it's something to consider, I'm not suggesting you do it, is to partner up with some other organisation that offers another product and service that can be value adding either yours or that yours can value add. So it could be an Internet of Things type provider. Let's say, for example, and I'm just going to purely pick this out of the air as an example. Let's say it was like FarmBot that makes devices for monitoring water points on farm, water flow pressure, or it could be a company that provides like Delta. That provides soil moisture probes. What you're doing is now providing some meaning to your source data or using your data to provide a synoptic view for otherwise point data. So yeah, I just think that don't necessarily go find a corporate farmer who will buy your derived product. Maybe on the way there, find an existing provider of other service that you can A, tap into the network with, but also B, demonstrate the value add.
That's great. I love that description, Dave. Any other questions? Now's your chance. Otherwise, we will say thanks very much, Dave. I really appreciate you making the time, sharing your long and extensive knowledge of the whole system, how it fits together, and where the value sits, not just for a company, but from Earth observation as a technology.
It's a pleasure. And just to point out, if you'd like, I'll type in the chat, but just check out our website, foodagility.com. And the reason is that at the very least, it'll give you my contact details, and I'm happy just to point you to somebody else. Like I said, I'm not in the business of harvesting business, but like Brendan and John and Phil and a few others, well connected and know where a lot of bodies are buried. So happy to make introductions if it would help.
Sorry, I'm chuckling about the bodies being buried somewhere. All right. Well, thanks very much, Dave. Really appreciate it. Feel free to stick around, whatever you need to do. Thanks. So I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking Dave Lamb for that. There's a real lot of information in there on the agriculture, R&D landscape, as he said, how companies can work together and where value lies. So thank you again, Dave. We're going to move on to now to a slightly different but related theme around industry collaboration. Now, industry collaboration, we've had an introduction to it through Dave there. What we're going to talk about now is a couple of the other organisations, infrastructures that exist to enable that collaboration to happen. First, I'd like to introduce you to Jonathon Medway from Sturt University.
Before we do that, we're going to have a quick networking break.
You would like to do that, certainly.
Yep. So what we're going to do is we're going to very quickly, we're going to have some breakout rooms set up here in Zoom, so you won't need to do anything at all. Each room will have about 6 minutes, and so I'll allow each person to quickly run through, and you'll have about 60 seconds to say what you found most interesting from that keynote presentation by David Lamb just then. Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Oh.
So, what was the highlight of the breakout rooms? Does anyone have anything they'd really like to share before we move on to the next part of our program?
Well, certainly the thing that was highlighted in the room where I was with Roman was just that the interest around using satellite imagery for pasture biomass. That seems not to be a thing that's required in Europe because of the scale and different production systems, and highlighting that it's a critical component for a large section of the Australian landmass.
Mm.
Lucky we're doing something about it.
I said, watch this space, Phil.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't stolen your thunder, Phil. Fantastic. All right. I might, in the interest of time, I might make a move on and start off the industry collaboration session with, as we mentioned before, Jonathon Medway from Sturt University. He's really involved with something which is being developed there called the Global Digital Farm. I'll get Jonathon to tell you more about exactly what it is, what it's got. What I will say is that I think in that chain, if you like, from Earth observation in Europe to Earth observation in Australia, there, as we know, there's tuning, there's customization of algorithms that needs to go on, validation of products that needs to go on. And what Jonathon will talk about in terms of global digital farm is something that's really been constructed that fits neatly into that pathway, if you like. So it's a very key piece of infrastructure that, if we think about what Dave Lamb was talking about and saying, at the end of the day, Earth observation is the start, not the end, and we want to add value, this is a key piece in the chain that creates that value. So with any further ado, Jonathon, I'll pass over to you to tell us more about the Global Digital Farm.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. I'll just see if we can share a screen here. So has something come up? Okay, terrific. So so this evening, just going to quickly talk about the Global Digital Farm program here at Sturt University and identify a couple of potential avenues where some of the European partners might be interested in working with us to evaluate, demonstrate and develop their services for the Australian market. The background, we're just going on here. Okay, that's gone through. So the background to where digital agriculture sits in Australia is that it's been identified as being a critical opportunity for substantially growing the Australian agriculture, but there's some key impediments that need to be worked through before we can do that. So we need to assess what is the availability of the different data and technology to work for growers. We certainly need to be working on improving the digital literacy of the Australian market. So that's both the farmers and off-farm along the value chain. So the consultants and agronomists and retailers all need to fairly substantially improve their understanding of digital technologies. We need to look at how do we analyse all the data that's being made available and to integrate it into decision support tools, because more often than not, agriculture is complex biological systems. We need to be bringing in data from multiple sources to be able to make sense of it. So we need those decision support tools. Most importantly, we need to be able to demonstrate what's the value proposition for each of these technologies. We need to look at how do we improve connectivity across the Australian landscape, because it's a big place and not all farmers have good cellular phone access. So we need to deal with that. And there's also issues around legal and regulatory constraints. And so the beginning of last year, Sturt University with the Food Agility CRC announced a program to utilise the CSU, the Sturt University farm, to see how many of these different impediments we could be addressing. And looking at doing that through a project or program we're calling the Global Digital Farm Initiative, where in the first instance, it's about $10 million worth of investment in equipping the farm and building research capability to enhance both the on-farm teaching, research and industry engagement capability that we have on our farm, to partner with the industry and technology sector, and to demonstrate the commercial scale applications of a whole range of technologies that are being developed around the world. As way of a bit of quick background, Sturt University is located in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. So it's sort of halfway between Melbourne and Sydney, down in the southeast corner of the continent. The university is spread out. We have multiple campuses across Eastern Australia with over 40,000 students, and we're the largest provider of undergraduate agriculture subjects. So there's over 1,700 agriculture and environment students. There's another 600 animal science and vet students. And there's also over 7,000 IT students who are increasingly becoming integrated into the ag program at being able to work with artificial intelligence and machine learning and image processing and those sorts of things. So there's a good resource of students there to be working in this particular space. The region where we're based is a very rich agricultural region that's producing over $2 billion worth of annual agricultural production. And here in Wagga, we're around 600 millimetres annual rainfall. And in the eastern part of our zone, there's alpine slopes ranging out into the wide sort of grasslands and irrigated floodplains to the western part of the region. We sort of mainly focus on wheat, canola, rice and cotton from a cropping perspective. There's a lot of beef, lamb and wool produced. There's also viticulture, horticulture and tree crops. So it's a very diverse agricultural region. And the university, through its connections with a whole range of different farming systems organisations, is indirectly partnered with over 3,000 producers across southeastern Australia. So it's a fairly comprehensive and diverse region to be working in agriculturally. The actual farm here at Sturt University, that the Wagga Wagga campus of the university is based on, was established back in 1892 as an experimental farm. So we've got 130 years of agricultural research, education and industry involvement, which by Australian standards is quite old. The farm itself is just over 2,000 hectares. We're producing over 1,000 hectares of annual crops. So that's wheat, barley, canola, lupins primarily. There's 600 hectares of perennial pastures that are supporting 500 cows and a couple of thousand sheep. There's a few hundred hectares of biodiversity zones. There's centre pivot irrigation. There's viticulture. There's horticulture, as well as the couple of hundred hectares where the campus buildings and all the student and teaching accommodation activities are occurring. So it really is quite a diverse landscape that is being operated at commercial scale under commercial conditions. And the Global Digital Farm program is simply to looking at how do we upgrade the capability across that farm with sensors and technology to be collecting as much data and information as possible, to then be sorting through all those different data streams to try and figure out which ones are the useful ones, how do they be developed into decision support tools, how do we work with the improved centre pivot systems, where we're looking at building a robot ready vineyard. So essentially building a vineyard adjacent to the existing vineyards we've had here for several decades, to design and build something that's purpose built for working with robotic and autonomous systems. We've been investing in sensor networks and virtual reality and essentially across the whole farm to look at how do we build this landscape laboratory to try and decipher the fit for digital technologies to enable our producers to do things more efficiently. And so in doing that, we're going to be collecting data of our own across the whole range of activities. So there's landscape data around topography and soils, biodiversity, our carbon footprint, grain and yield quality mapping, pasture biomass, all the farm records that go with producing the diversity of crops that we're doing. Looking at how we integrate all kinds of remote sensing, how we link that to a soil moisture probe network, where we might end up having over 100 locations on the farm where we're measuring soil moisture and other soil characteristics on a daily basis or an hourly basis. Livestock systems, carbon systems, it really is just this massive data collection to then decipher how do we put that to good use. Some particular aspects of that, which I'm assuming overlap very strongly with this particular group, is that remote sensing is always going to play a very important role in making sense of the data that we're collecting. We've got a really extensive soil mapping program, so a whole range of different sensors and things that are going to be collecting soils information on a regular basis to again be linked into the remote sensing and then the yield mapping and the other stationary sensor network that's going to be there, so that we can then be starting to look at how do we identify production zones and come up with improved management opportunities around crop selection, crop management, fertilizer management, carbon, all those sorts of things. It's not just about the plants. There's a whole range of livestock-based activities, and so whether that's directly measuring our pasture supply on the ground, whether it's working with companies like Phil and SIBO Labs to utilise remote sensing based measurements, but then also working with livestock-based systems as well. So as Dave was talking about earlier, having GPS tags on cattle to locate their or to identify their activity on an almost hourly basis, to be looking at field weighing systems, all that sort of stuff. It's all going to add to this massive data that we're going to be collecting across the farm, and also, as well as working with some of those existing systems, is building some new systems. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be dedicating a new area to a robot-ready vineyard, which has all kinds of implications for sensor networks, remote sensing, across the whole spectrum of the wine producing system. It's also about how do we integrate our individual paddocks and individual farm locations into a much bigger landscape. So there's a lot of information that's available at a national scale here in Australia. So we want to look at how do some of those national soil characteristics and soil classification layers integrate with our very high resolution paddock-based activities. And in order to be able to then make sense of how do we transfer what we're learning here on our farm with the hundreds and thousands of producers that we're also working with. So how do we take our learned experience and learned knowledge to the wider farming community to bring them along with the journey. And certainly with all of this information that's being generated, is that ultimately, like many markets around the world, where labour shortages are a critical driver of production systems here in Australia. So we're looking at how do we utilise all of this information to ultimately get the best out of the potential for automating a whole range of largely mechanical activities across our farming enterprises. And so when we contemplate all those sorts of things that we're talking about, I think there's potentially a number of opportunities that are available for Agtech companies, whether they're Australian based or internationally based, is that essentially we're open for business for providing access to the data that we're already collecting. So ultimately we're collecting hundreds, potentially thousands of layers of data across a whole range of different production systems. So if someone has a service that needs a validation or testing, then we're quite open for the idea of working with those companies to show how the information being generated by those services and capabilities compares to what we're actually measuring as being on the ground. And that might even include customized data collection, that if a particular project needs something specific to be done, then we're quite happy to look at, well, okay, how do we make that happen? Collaborating in projects, making PhD students and master's students available to be working on projects, or to just be looking at how do we evaluate and demonstrate the services that companies are interested in working with us on. And ultimately, once we get to the point where those services can be shown to be potentially adding good value to Australian producers, then looking at how do we open up the doors to that network of producers that we're currently working with to expand out the validation processes and to look at how we can be making sense of the products and the services that are there. So hopefully there's a few little pointers there as to some opportunities to be working with Charles Sturt University, and really happy to. I'm not sure, Brendan, if we're going to be taking questions now or to be part of the process in a little while to see how we fit into the bigger picture.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. Look, as I mentioned at the start, I think what you're talking about there is a critical piece of infrastructure and the value chain, to provide that value to the user and the farmer at the end of the day, right? The technology is great, but we've got to do the right things with it so we provide value at the end, and this is a critical part. If it's okay with you, we might move on to the next presentation and have some joint question and answer at the end. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, totally fine. Happy to be here till the end.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So what I'd like to introduce now, Tash Teakle. She has a number of hats across this, agriculture industry intersection from different pieces. She is with a founder of a company called Agristart, which starts to work with startups and scale-ups and small to medium enterprises in not just in metro areas, but in the rural areas, and really building up rural economies based on, how do we do new things? How do we build businesses to help people support their livelihoods in the regional areas? I've known Tash for a while. I think what she does is really, really fantastic, building up these, like I say, these kind of collaborations in this kind of industry. So I'll pass over to her now to talk a bit more about how this agricultural landscape for collaboration and industry looks from her perspective. Thanks, Tash.
Great, thanks, Brendan. It's so great to be here with you all. So, hola, mi nombre es Natasha, mi habla español un poquito. And that's about all I've got. Sorry, guys. I spent about 3 months backpacking around South America when I was just after I finished my PhD. So that little bit of Spanish has stayed with me, but I've probably completely, with the Aussie accent, it never quite sounds right anyway. But what I would love to talk to you about is how we are really passionate about connecting, you know, all across Australia and to global startups, all the key players in the AgTech ecosystem. And it's something that as a farmer's daughter, I'm very passionate about. And I love, you know, the work that we can do to really enable some of the satellite and earth observation technology on farm. And I think learning from other sectors and making sure we can make better decisions with that, you know, really valuable data that we're collecting now is something that I can really see a big future in. So I guess my background in the ag tech space, obviously I think big credentials being a farmer's daughter, but it's not obviously everything, and it's given me a bit of a grounding into, I guess, some of the problems facing farmers on farm. But I was very passionate about the science behind farming and had about 8 years working in the plant biotech space, and then started our business Agristart. We have run several AgTech accelerator programs. We've got a national one that we're running with AgriFutures Australia at the moment, which is a really great organisation to connect in with. If you haven't heard of the Evoke Ag conference that's coming to Adelaide in February next year, might be something to have on your radar. It's a massive international conference, over 1,000 delegates, so that's something to keep in mind. I've also been on the board of Ausagritech. I've just jumped off, so it's great to see there's going to be a talk today from Ausagritech. Great to see Cara on the line. I'm also on the Western panel for an organisation called the Grains Research and Development Corporation, and that's really about taking farmer levies and investing them into further research and adoption. That's really going to make a difference on farm. So I guess I would like to start by just looking at some of the global hype around ag tech, and particularly why that's relevant in Australia and why it makes a difference when you're trying to connect in to the Australian supply chain. So I guess we hear a lot of rhetoric around, you know, we've got to feed the growing population, a lot of disruption in the technology space, we want to leverage our clean and green image. And in Australia, we always talk about becoming a $100 billion ag tech industry by 2030. Which does show there's lots of opportunities for those trying to get into this sector. But I guess the question I always pose, well, why don't we have this $100 billion industry yet? What do we need to do to actually make some progress in getting towards that goal? And I guess this tweet that was shared by a farmer from Western Australia a few years ago, and to put this into context, this is not any average farmer. This is a farmer, I mean, most farmers are very high tech anyway, but this farmer in particular has started his own app, which takes weather and yield data and uses it for predicting future yields. And he was so frustrated by the technology not being robust enough, so that when he's in, you know, in the tractor in the middle of the night trying to get his seeding program done, that it's very hard to actually fix anything that goes wrong. So that frustration around any technology that can't be just fixed on farm, because farmers are real fixers, so it goes in. And I guess another area where we're seeing a few gaps, and this is really, you know, important for some of the satellite data that's being collected, is that you can make such amazing pretty maps these days, of course, as most of you can probably do quite quickly, but it's actually taking those maps and thinking about how can we make better decisions with them. So for example, with that frost map that you can see in the middle, you know, my brother, who's a farmer, saw this map and he's like, well, it doesn't really help me make a better decision post the event, but I guess maybe it could, you know, relate to whether he cuts a crop for hay rather than trying to take it off for grain. But it is really about connecting this awesome data that we can collect and thinking about making better decisions from it. So I won't talk to this too much. I know we've got other speakers covering the ecosystem, but the point I want to make here is that it is a really growing ecosystem in Australia. And if you're trying to bring new products to the market here, it's making sure you can fit in amongst the noise and being really aware of, I guess, what it is that is your competitive advantage. Because farmers, you know, they know obviously what, you know, technology and tools they're using. They know what their farmers are using. There's always lots of conversation at the local pub. So if you can't explain to them how your product or technology or service is going to be providing a competitive advantage or making their life easier in some way, it's going to be very hard to get through the noise. And I guess in this space, there's so many awesome new technologies coming through that I think need to be supported by some of the Earth observation data as well. So it's got to be around, you know, anything that's going to help farmers make better decisions on farm, and linking into some of the other new initiatives that we're seeing around, you know, 3D printing, improved processing of food on farm, so we're not just exporting raw material, e-commerce platforms, and of course things around provenance and blockchain are becoming increasingly important as well. So it's about linking some of these technologies together and thinking about how we can actually make better decisions from all the data that we're collecting. And without using too many COVID cliches, I think it is really important to think about our customer in this so-called new world post-COVID. And it's really important to think about consumers of your technology and, you know, what is it that they now need in their lives, and have their buying patterns change? Potentially your actual customers have changed. I think it's good just to step back and think about our customer. And in the Agtech sector in Australia, sometimes it can get a bit blurry between who is actually your paying customer, who is actually a user of your technology, and then who actually benefits from it. And in some cases, these might be all one and the same, but in some cases, the paying customer might be one of the agronomists, or it might actually be a chemical company. The end user might then be the farmer who actually uses the technology or uses the data. Then the beneficiary might almost be us as consumers. So it's really important to think about these in the context of, you know, trying to get your channel to market as well. And on that access to market and doing trials with farmers, I think it's worth having a bit of a think about that adoption curve. So obviously, when you're trying new technology and you want feedback and want to iron out all the bugs and, you know, get some use cases in place, it is really important that you are talking to those at the far end of the adoption curve. So, you know, the really early adopters, the innovators, the visionaries, they're the ones that are really excited to try anything. So in those early days for the trials, it's really great to get buy-in from them. But at the end of the day, if you want to cross the so-called chasm, or the valley of death as I prefer it, and get into the mainstream market, you really need to be talking to the farmers who are in the middle of that adoption curve. And I often, for the technology companies we work with, get them talking to farmers pretty much at all ends of the spectrum, because it's so important when you're doing your customer validation to get those different perspectives, and knowing that if you actually want to have massive growth of your company, you're going to be having to sell to that middle group. And they're the ones that wait and see, you know, what the early adopters are doing first, and wait until they've ironed out all the issues before they're going to adopt it. And I think in terms of some of the opportunities for this data that, you know, we're getting such better access to now, it can really create opportunities right across the supply chain. So I think in terms of solving some of these food security issues, obviously connectivity is a big part of it, which we've already heard a bit about today, so I won't touch on that. Anything that's going to improve market access and supply chains, opportunities to value add. I think the cross-sector technology opportunities in the Agtech sector are still underdone. So much we can learn from other sectors. So even thinking about, you know, a technology you might be using in defence or space, how can we then apply that into Agtech? And of course, there's a huge focus now on improving sustainability, reducing waste, reducing carbon emissions. So any technology that's going to support, you know, measurement of carbon on farm, for example, is going to be really valuable. And so I think for farmers, when you're thinking about what is your unique value proposition for your technology, it's really about focusing on those problems that need solving. It's not just about the bottom line. Although obviously if somebody's going to improve their gross margin, that's going to be a win. But things that are going to improve consumer health is obviously a big focus. Anything that can save farmers time. So if, you know, providing, you know, we talked about the pasture growth in our breakout session before. So anything that's going to save them time in making measurements and, you know, improving their decision making is of course going to be of interest. things are going to be of value to the environment. And of course, farm safety is a big one, which I'd like to see a much bigger focus on in the future. And just thinking about that gross margin when you're talking to farmers. So I guess it's not just a matter of saying, you know, this is going to improve your yield by X%, or it's going to reduce your costs. You really need to think about, for farmers, that gross margin being a combination of, you know, improving the price that they can get, improving the yield, or reducing the cost. And this quite simple model, which is done by Ross Kingswell, who's a really fantastic economist here in Australia, really just gives a nice example that if you just have a 1% improvement in the price, or a 1% increase in your yield, and then a 1% decrease in your production costs, you're actually coming up with a much better proposition for farmers. So that's only a 30% increase. So this very simple model just highlights that those small changes that you can make across those key elements of the gross margin are going to make a big difference on farm. And being able to communicate this to growers is really important when you're promoting your Agtech. So I guess just in summarising what the growers are looking for, so really highlighting, as I've mentioned before, how you are different from other products that are in the market. How can your data actually make a difference to them on farm? Thinking about how it's going to save them time or money, or improve sustainability, or improve health. And just always remembering that 1% rule around the growth margin. And finally, this is just, my very personal opinion on agriculture, that I think it is a little bit different to other sectors. And I think it's the people. It is often regional people, and regional people have additional challenges. So it's working in the city, and that does lead to more collaboration. It leads to resilience. And this example from a few years ago, when there was a drought over in New South Wales on the east coast of Australia, and WA farmers were actually trucking hay over to New South Wales farmers to help them out during the drought. And if you compare this to, say, the mining sector, it'd be very unlikely you'd be seeing two mining companies on different sides of the country helping each other out if there was an impact to their supply. So I think this, to me, this just summarises, I'm a bit biased, obviously, but I do think the sector is different to others in the way it will band together, and it is very collaborative. So I'll stop there, and I'm also happy to take questions now or a bit later if we're running out of time. Brendan, thanks everyone.
Great, thanks Tash. Are you able to stick around for a little while, or would you? You've got other duties. Should we ask any questions now? Or?
I've got to 4:30.
Okay, well, why don't we, if there's any questions for Tash from that great presentation, opportunity to ask those now. All I say is I agree with the, what you're talking about there. It's about people, and it's about community is really strong across the ag sector, and I think that, as you said, makes it different to other industry sectors. That's my 2 cents.
Also, I'll put my email address in the chat, so if anyone wants to follow up, very welcome as well.
Any questions for Tash from any of our ConnectEO folks who are online at the moment? If not, I'll just take just a quick moment, because I really like the work you do and the way you described it, Tash, about the importance of the end user, and that idea that so you might have a customer and an end user and a beneficiary who might not be the same person. At the end of the day, how when you're thinking about it from your kind of perspective in terms of technology providing value to the industry, then how do you go about breaking those up, or is there important things to think about when they might not be the same, the same person?
Yeah, look, it depends on each company. So, and for each product, and it's just really important to think about, who is actually going to be paying for this technology, and it's not always the farmers. So you create a whole heap of marketing material aimed at farmers, but it's actually the chemical company you need to be selling it to, then that's going to obviously have a bit of a mismatch. So it's really important for your marketing and making sure you've got the messaging right. And I think agronomists are also quite overwhelmed. I think it was mentioned in the previous session as well that the digital capability of a lot of agronomists is not at the level where it needs to be. And a lot of agronomists are feeling overwhelmed by all the new technology coming out, and they're not sure how to advise them. And it's really important for the companies on the line to understand in the Australian farming market, farmers are so reliant on their agronomists. They're a very trusted advisor. They're involved in, all aspects of their farming program and their budgeting. So it's a very important relationship to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And we've been talking about that kind of stuff with John Medway, and as well as, what does the digital agronomist start to look like?
Yeah.
The next generation of
I've heard the word tech agronomist before. That's definitely something we need to see more of.
I think this is the ecosystem that's going to start to produce those kind of those kind of experts, I think.
And look, I'm really keen to learn more about the businesses online and getting to know them throughout the program. So yeah, I'll be in touch separately with the businesses as well.
Oh, that's right. So for our ConnectEO folks, you may have already made appointments, or you will have the opportunity to talk with Tash a bit more about those kind of business models and refining that value pitch for the Australian market as well. So thank you very much, Tash. Please stay around for as long as you're able. Always Thanks, appreciate your inputs on those kind of things. We might move along now to hear from Grant Gilmour. So Grant is from one of the directors of Beanstalk AGRITECH. Beanstalk have recently done a lot of work in mapping the Agtech ecosystem across Australia, and also have a role in capital to put into the industry to talk about the development of the new technologies that we're talking about here. So I think this is going to be really interesting, and we'll certainly complement what Tash has been talking about, what Jonathon's talking about, and the larger overview provided by Dave Lamb a little bit earlier. So Grant, I will pass the floor over to you.
Good, thanks, Brendan. Rosny, if you could allow me to start sharing a video, that'd be great. And I'll also share my screen when you are able to let me. Great, there you go. Hello, everyone. So while the screen sharing gets up and going, Grant Gilmour, based in Perth. My background, I grew up on a cattle farm in Zimbabwe, actually, and moved to Australia when everyone else did in the early 2000s. Got into management consulting, worked for a company called the Boston Consulting Group for 6 years around the world, and then did a stint in banking. But my passion was always agriculture. So I always wanted to go back and get back into farming, and my wife said basically over my dead body. So Beanstalk Agtech is a chance for me to merge my two passions, which are agriculture, but also advisory. So, and in particular, I lead our digital team at Beanstalk. There are 10 of us. We've got offices in Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, and Singapore, and we advise some of Australia's and the Indo-Pacific's leading agri businesses. So I'll share what we do, but a bit broader than that, but our basic mission is to unlock the power of ag to be a leading force for good. We work with innovators, startups, producers, processors, investors, and government bodies. We do 4 things essentially, so I'll just walk you through that here, and might actually just get this to be a bit bigger. So here we go. It should be full screen. Where are we? There we go. Full screen mode. You'll see that. So we do investment advisory on that right-hand side, number 4. So we work with family offices, high net worth individuals to advise their investment into agtech, and then we bring ecosystems together of like-minded players. We've done this in India, Papua New Guinea, and Vietnam. So that's where we help agtech companies get a foothold in new markets. Venture growth services. So we work with some of Australia's leading ag techs and the most exciting ones, and we support them to go to market, raise capital. And then obviously number 1, working right to left, corporate innovation. So when Tash mentioned about agronomists being overwhelmed, that's kind of the role that we try to fill, is advise, have our finger on the pulse, know what makes sense for a particular producer. We're more working with kind of larger scale ones, but that's our business. But today, so this is a proprietary piece of work that Beanstalk's done. So it's not shared with the market more broadly. But basically, we've done a state of play for all of Australian agriculture, and this is the Agtech a deep dive. I'm not going to go through 1 to 7. I'm going to focus on 3 things, given the timing: an overview of the industry, a market map of where the Agtech ecosystem is in Australia, and then investment into ag and food tech in Australia. But shout out if you'd like to go deeper into any of those other topics. I'll throw my email in here, and I'm happy to have a chat after this if any of the other ones about infrastructure, the research institutions, and some of the leading companies would be relevant to you. So in terms of an overview, I'll do four things. 30,000-foot view when we think about Earth observation, a global comparison, a bit of a SWOT analysis, and a timeline of growth that'll kind of tie a few pieces of what you've heard together here. So this is the ecosystem in Australia as of March this year. So a huge amount happening, and you'll see this a bit later on the East Coast. Particularly around New South Wales and Victoria. WA, Tash is holding the fort here with the Harvest Accelerator and Agristart, and AgriFutures, Meetup, Evoke Ag, kind of across Australia as well. There's a few organisations supporting, but these are the major ones, right? A global comparison. There's a bit of information here, read it as I go along, but the big takeaway is that investment into ag or agri-food tech in Australia is still small. It's definitely picked up in the last 5 to 6 years, but compared to global peers, we're roughly 20th largest when we focus on upstream ag tech alone. When we look at agri-food tech, we're not in the top 20. We're 15th when we look at ag tech investment. But there's a couple of countries like Sweden, Japan, Finland, and the Netherlands that are Israel, smaller populations, smaller countries, investing more into ag tech. So it's not by no means a function of population here. But it's definitely, you can kind of see the trends definitely trending upwards in the last 5 years, and we'll look into this a bit more. SWOT analysis, there's a hell of a lot of information here. So I've just bolded a couple of the more important ones that we see as strengths of Australian ag tech ecosystem. We have all climatic zones. We're a big country, right? So major production types represented, so suitable for all sorts of ag techs, right? Not just one style, particularly earth observation, given the size and the scale of the country. We're counter-seasonal to the world's major markets, allowing tightening of a feedback loop for development solutions. So we view that as a positive. And then a really strong kind of supply of agricultural researchers and scientists in the space. That's strengths, weaknesses. We're still relatively young, to be honest. And so when we say poor commercialization track record of our research and development corporations and universities, I think we've done some amazing stuff. It's probably a bit harsh to say poor commercialization. I just think there hasn't been a focus on the commercial side as opposed to the research side. That's definitely starting to pick up. Amazing work done by organisations like Food Agility and their partners. Australia is still a tiny market, right? So most startups, in order to be successful and get scale, have to expand pretty quickly out of Australia. But then again, on the flip side, it's a bit of a strength. It's a great place and a safe place to test. One of the weaknesses we've seen historically, I think that's changing, is that a bit of a lack of focus on challenges on the demand side. So to use Tash's language, not enough focus on the customer on the demand side and too much focus just on the tech on the supply side. Opportunities, work more closely with universities, particularly in the commercialization aspect. And then we think Brisbane is a sleeping giant for AgTech. Queensland has a huge agri-sector, very significant government support, great success stories of companies working there in AgTech, but not a huge amount of incubators, accelerators. It doesn't have the right scale. So we think there's an opportunity in Brisbane and in the Queensland market in particular. There's a couple of threats. We've seen the tech wreck of the last few months. That'll start to dry up some early stage VCs. Risk appetite's kind of dampen over the next couple of years, so it's a bit of a threat. And then we need to get industry more involved in managing AgTech innovation programs like Tash, and kind of government maybe lesser extent than they have done in the past, and definitely include our customers as part of that. I'm not going to go too much more into that. Right, this is the interesting timeline. So SproutX launched as the first real AgTech accelerator incubator in Australia in 2016. Started delivering cohorts then. So that was 6 years ago, right? The first real investment came in 2017, and there's been a boom since then. So there's roughly 15 AgTech incubators and accelerators in Australia at the moment of varying sizes. But you can see we're in the very early stages of a boom here in terms of our AgTech ecosystem in Australia. So it's really, really growing quickly. And that's led to a bit of a whiplash, I think. Various people have referred to it in the industry. And a bit, in an industry where doing things as past generations did them just made good sense, right? So there's a bit of a feeling of whiplash here. That will adjust in time as we get more focused and as our incubators and accelerators, encourage and guide that startup ecosystem to be very, very focused or hyper-focused on the demand sides as opposed to the supply side of their tech. So not going to go into this. So I'm going to skip through all this information here and look at the market map. 3 things I'm going to talk about here: density by region, I kind of alluded that to already, and then 2 things you may be interested in, which is the breakdown of sector focus and solution type. This is just an easier to read summary of the previous page that you saw, but the East Coast really holds most of the industry, or the AgTech industry in Australia. We think that this Queensland region up here in the northeast is a bit of a sleeping giant. It produces a huge amount of our food, and it's showing all the signs of really high growth potential. It hasn't yet taken up. So we think that's an opportunity. In terms of sector focus of AgTechs in Australia, most of the livestock and cropping, right? Makes sense. Horticulture and viticulture, kind of a close third, and then there's a bunch of other small things in that other bucket there. But the 2 largest industries in Australia are livestock and cropping, so that really shouldn't come as any surprises. This is probably slightly more interesting here from your perspective, which is what are the solution types in industry. So data analysis and storage collection being huge, that's a pretty big bucket, so understandably it's pretty big, but mapping and imagery services being about 5% of solutions at the moment. So yeah, that's a bit of a breakdown there. I won't go through some of the leading agri-food or the AgTech. Tash, you've already taken thanks for showing this already, but you can see this is the data analysis when we talk about that 20% of solution providers. This is them over here, and then mapping and imagery over here. And you can follow the links to Agtech Finder and whatnot to look into this a bit more. Right, to finish off, ag and food tech investment. So overview here, early stage investments well below global averages, also on a total basis. As well as in comparison to the size of our industry. So there's definitely more investment needed in the industry. So we attracted 30 million of capital in 2017, new deal flow in 2020 of about 90 million. Hopefully that's a bit more in 2022. But like I say, there's a few headwinds from global markets at the moment that may dampen that a little bit. So beyond the total investment, we think there's room for new investor models in the ecosystem, and definitely a lot of room for investor education. We do a lot of that. So a lot of due diligence work, a lot of supporting strategy work with guiding strategy for some of our investors. And there's probably education on the flip side as well needed on the startup side. For some of these models. Who are some of the key investors? Tenacious, Artesian, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, Grok, Main Sequence. You probably may be aware of some of these, right down to Square Peg, who we do a bit with, and Agfunder and Blackbird as well. So, and then there's on the corporate side of things as well. We've got Woolworths, GrainCorp, Mars, Mondelez, MLA as well. Food agility could be on there as well as you co-invest as well. But that's more, that's kind of, yeah, on the CRC side. So those are some of the key investors. Right, that's a fly through there. Didn't want to go over time. As you can see, there was plenty to talk about, but realised that, you know, got a relatively small gap here. So I'll throw my my email in the chat. So feel free to reach out if you'd like to know any more.
Fantastic. Thanks, Grant. Okay, I think like I learned stuff out of your presentation as well. So fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I think it's two of the things I think stand out for me from that is one, just, you know, the ecosystem map, how many components that it has. And I think then just your last slide, like the proliferation of, you know, available venture capital, you know, to start looking at these kind of things as well. Like I think that's something which has really built up, you know, over the last few years and those kind of things. Yeah. I mean, do you have any thoughts like on that trajectory? You know, so there's certainly a lot of funds going into it, and what does that trajectory look like in the near and longer term, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So if we take a macro perspective, in the Asia Pacific region, of which Australia is a part of the food bowl, right? There'll be a 50% increase in population over the next 30 years. By 2050, there'll be 5 billion people to feed. That will require a 60 to 70% increase in food production needed in the region if we continue to consume protein at the rate that we do. A lot of people say Australia's at peak acreage. Debatable, but what isn't debatable is that we are definitely at peak acreage if we don't want to clear any more land, right? So the only way to increase food production without actually destroying our natural resource base is to use tech and innovation. So demand side is huge from a macro perspective, I think. In a short term or medium term, so it's a massive growing area, right? Food security is a huge global issue. Will not dampen driven by increases in population in the Asia Pacific region. So very, very bullish on the demand side of we're going to need to do something. So there's huge opportunities everywhere, and as just kind of pointed out earlier, low kind of maturity of innovation in the industry relative to other industries. So lots of opportunity there. In the short to medium term, definite boom in Australia of our Agtech innovation industry. Definite increases in the volume of capital, but still nothing like global other industries. We don't have the reputation that Israel does yet, or San Fran, or kind of the Palo Alto region there. So there's definite opportunities there. That being said, I think in the next couple of years, things will be a little bit dampened by the global market environment.
Right.
So long term, great. Medium term, really strong. Short term, it could be a bit volatile, but we'd love to be proven wrong.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for that insight and that overview, Grant. Are you sticking around for a little while?
Yeah, stick around.
Right, because we might hear from Cara Glenn now from Ausagritech to tell us about that really vibrant community that she's built, because I think that's outstanding, and I think it's, you know, really a good thing to know about in terms of collaboration across the industry. Then we'll have time for some more Q&A. So to those in the audience, if you're thinking about questions, you can either hold on to them or put them into the chat, and we'll certainly address those after Cara Glenn has talked more about Ausagritech. So thank you. And by way of introduction, so Cara is the engagement manager for the Ausagritech Association. I've been to a couple of their online forums, and I do describe them as some of the most vibrant that I've been a part of. So thank you very much, Cara, for being part of this forum this afternoon, because I think what you've got to talk about will certainly be of interest to the cohort of the ConnectEO SMEs. So please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. And we're really proud to be here as a representative of Ausagritech. And I'm really going to just give today a bit of a strategic and sort of short update, I suppose, on how Ausagritech has built and continues to provide pathways for engagement and for growth in the agri-tech ecosystem in Australia. So we've heard a lot from all of the speakers so far, which has been so brilliant. And we've covered a lot of ground, I suppose, on how agri-tech represents an incredible opportunity. And we really believe that there's further opportunity to improve agricultural production, create resilient supply chains, create jobs and drive economic growth, both in domestic and international avenues here in Australia in regards to agri-tech. So thank you to Brendan and Roshni for providing this avenue for us to discuss where we're positioned in Australia. And I'll be providing some of the insights from Ausagritech from the perspective of being the peak body for agri-tech in Australia, and including how we've sort of nurtured some of the growth of this sector and what collaboration looks like and can look like in the sector as well. So as Brendan said, I'm the Marketing and Membership Engagement Manager for Ausagritech, but like Tash, I'm actually from a farming family as well. So I'm from not so sunny at the moment, but North Queensland, and my family's in bananas. So alongside me as well, our CEO, Tracy Martin, is also from a farming background, and many of our committee members as well. So we really have that perspective, I suppose, of both the ag and the tech applications of Agtech, and that's something that we share with a lot of our members as well. And so Tracy, our CEO, and our committee, both the present committee and the past committee, have really driven the agenda of shaping the future of agri-tech in Australia and its contribution to the economy alongside our corporate partners and our Agri-Tech Leaders Alliance members and the entire membership base as well of Ausagritech. So we're well known for this little map, which is going to come up next on the screen, hopefully, which has already been shown a couple of times in the presentation so far. So this is the Australian Agri-Food Tech map, but it's not really a map. It's more of a visual state of play, I suppose, in regards to the landscape of agri-tech in Australia. And as of our most recent iteration, the version pictured here has 450 organisations, but the most recent one will have 500. So there's actually 500 organisations who will appear in the version, which will be updated really soon. So we're 500 organisations strong, but that's not to say that that's an exhaustive understanding. There's actually a lot of organisations who don't feature on this visual guide and who we're working to understand. And that's why the association sort of, we've been launching projects such as the Australian Agritech Ecosystem Survey, which will hopefully give us a better understanding of the agritechs and the different subsectors that they occupy in agritech as well. So the interesting point to note, which has been discussed already in the presentation so far, is that a lot of the subsectors of agritech, they contemporaneously cross over into a number of different tech applications. So you've got climate tech, envirotech, food tech as well. So a lot of the technologies can be applied to those different technology sectors and are being applied to those different technology sectors as well. So within our membership, we have a lot of organisations who will fit into more than one category, both pictured in this map and also not pictured in those external tech sectors, as I've said as well. And I suppose that's the whole point of what we do at Ausagritech, is we're trying to better understand the ecosystem and also trying to better connect the ecosystem. And so I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail shortly. But we really believe that the agri-tech sector is on the front line, enabling on-farm and supply chain adoption of technology. And we're really committed at Ausagritech, and we know our members are committed to, you know, the clean and green and sustainable future agenda that seems to be hot in discussion at the moment, in Australia at least, and I'm sure overseas as well. And our purpose at Ausagritech is to really bring the agritech ecosystem together, bring all of the key players together to grow and advance the ecosystem, which we believe is really vibrant and incredibly innovative as well. And so one of the key goals of the association so far this year has been to gain the better understanding, as I've mentioned. So to begin to bring together the different players within the Agritech ecosystem, which are not just the Agritechs themselves, but also the farmers and producers, the R&D bodies, government, and investment as well. So we see ourselves as a connection point, and that's just been based on, I suppose, how our engagement with the sector has run so far. So Ausagritech is a connection point, bringing together those various stakeholders across the sector. And our goal in all of that is to provide better opportunities for commercialisation and connection within the sector. So you'll see a little image coming up next, which will sort of show, obviously, a very brief version, a brief overview of the different players in the ecosystem in Australia. So we call this the agri landscape, and this is how we visually represent how Ausagritech works to join the dots in between some of these players in the ecosystem. So you can see that we've got the agri-food tech supply chain. And so that's comprised of our agri-techs, our food techs, envirotech, climate tech, and most importantly as well, our farmers and producers. And so, as I said, we're obviously very passionate, not just because of our personal interest in farming, but very passionate because our agri-techs are providing real solutions that can help farmers, and they're feeding the country. So we're really passionate about looking for opportunities to connect our agri-techs with farmers and to foster connection and collaboration between the agri-techs themselves. So we do this by primarily through profiling opportunities for collaboration. And we work with key national associations and key partners to promote those opportunities for our members to present or demonstrate or exhibit or network at these sort of various events, exhibitions, field days across the country. And it's really not uncommon, as you will have seen in some of the previous presentations as well, it's not uncommon to see Ausagritech members like SIVO Labs working together with other members and speaking alongside each other at events or hosting demonstrations or preparing and presenting at field days, or even just having their tech work alongside each other and be able to be integrated, because agri-tech is a collaborative industry. And at least from our standpoint at Ausagritech, we don't see our members shying away from the opportunity to integrate their technologies. So that's really interesting. And obviously Tash did mention that as well about integration. So coming into Australia, it is probably really important to understand that that is something that is happening and something that I believe and Ausagritech believes and our members believe will continue to happen as well. So we found that the agritech ecosystem is really engaged and really looking for opportunities to connect and partner and collaborate in the space. So we also work with government. We've actually gained a lot of traction this year on a government level. We've achieved some really great success in the regard of policy and advocacy, with thanks largely to our CEO, Tracy Martin, and our President, Andrew Coppin, and the entire committee, both the past committee and the present committee. We've just actually brought in a new committee as well. So in that capacity, in our relationship with government, Ausagritech has facilitated, awareness and advocacy on behalf of the agritechs in our membership, but also on behalf of the entire sector and the entire ecosystem as well. And we're really, really aiming to bring the profile of agritech forward on a government level, and not just on a government level, but also on the level of public awareness as well, making sure the public are informed about what agritech is and how it's helping them day in and day out, many maybe not even realising it. And so we also facilitate connections between research and development organisations and the agritech community. We really love the work that the R&D bodies are doing. We have one of our key partners is the Centre for Entrepreneurial Agri-Technology, CEAT. And so working alongside a number of different stakeholders, including CEAT and others, the accelerator programs, the innovation hubs, and more. Some of those you can see on the diagram on the screen there. we're working with them to provide opportunities for innovation and discovery in the ecosystem as well. So we're proud to provide those avenues so that the AGRITECH ecosystem can be recognised and discovered. And as well, we're hoping to connect them with pathways for development in programs that are suitable for them as well. So some of those are funded programs as well. So that's something that that we often promote, and you'll see that often promoted on our communications channels, as well as different grant opportunities, different R&D opportunities, and things like that. So finally, on that little landscape image there, you'll see investment. And we're passionate at Ausagritech about the growth of the sector. And so to this end, we've developed really strong relationships with investors in the local and global private sectors, and will continue to do so, as well as the VCs as well, to just provide more pathways, again, for connection, collaboration, opportunities and growth of the agri-tech sector as well. So through the resources such as the Ausagritech Agri-Food Tech Ecosystem Map, which I had on the slide previously, that's a really great resource for newcomers to the agri-tech ecosystem to better understand what organisations are currently in the space and what technologies are currently out there. And from a standpoint of investment, identifying areas for investment or cross collaboration, or identifying new subsectors that are up and coming as well. The map has been a very informal but widely used resource for that as well. And we also have our Ausagritech members directory too, which profiles everyone who is a member of the Australian Agritech Association, and that's searchable on our website. And partners can, contact us to make direct introductions with those members, or contact the members directly. So there's a lot of different avenues for connection and for the growth of the ecosystem, which again, that's really what Ausagritech is all about. That's what we're passionate about, and that's what we're going to continue to be working on. So we know that the agritech sector is a collaborative sector, and we commend every member of the ecosystem for the valuable role that they play in growing and also uniting the varied landscape. So there's work to be done there in the front of consolidation, and that's something that we're working on and will continue to work towards. But our statement is connect, promote, advance. And so that really summarises the approach that we take in connecting these various members of the ecosystem and the community, both in Australia and beyond as well. And so our profile and advocacy and engagement efforts have really empowered us to build and connect the dynamic ecosystem. And we're still as passionate as ever about achieving this objective, and we're by no means done yet. So that's really at the forefront of what we'll be doing. So through our members, we know that we already have world-class agricultural innovation here in Australia, and we're uniquely positioned to develop solutions across a lot of the subsectors that you will have seen in this little diagram here, and agricultural subsectors as well. And so we're working on a few core objectives that I thought I would share, which is to continue to connect the community of agritech innovators and farmers and investor groups, government regulators, research and development, industry bodies, and the interested public. And the purpose of that is to catalyse profitable innovation. So we'll continue to work on that towards the remainder of the year. We're continuing to develop and promote the market for Australian-based agtech solutions. And we're continuing to grow the value of the food and fibre sector here in Australia through development and adoption of technology, which does include export, and to expand Australia's role as a global agtech innovation hub and foster collaboration to that end as well. So that's really a summary of everything that we're working on, without me going into detail about each of the individual projects, which sort of fall underneath those objectives. But you can see all of those on our website, which is www.ausagritech.org. And we expect to see a lot of leadership coming to the forefront in Australian agritech, and particularly in areas that improve productivity and profitability for farmers, which I believe is a sentiment that Tash also echoed as well. So Yeah, so really seeing that in our membership base and seeing that in conversations with the peak bodies that represent farmers as well. But we can understand, given our engagement with those key players in the wider sector, that interoperability will be driven by the customers and by Agritechs. And by customers, we obviously mean farmers and producers. So we continue to view Agritech as a national necessity, and it's a global opportunity. And to this regard, we'll continue to engage with all of the key players in the ecosystem, both in Australia and internationally as well. So just to keep it tight on time, in closing, the future and potential for agri-technology in Australia is strong. At least we believe so from the perspective of Ausagritech, and we believe that there's a world of possibility remaining to continue to open the scope of connection and consolidation, again, as I said, actually starting to streamline the pathways of connection and collaboration in this ecosystem as well. So that's something that we'll continue to work toward, and something that we know continues to need to be done. And this little map here, as well as some of our other tools, will continue to grow as the ecosystem grows. And in our capacity as the peak body, you know, we continue to support the next steps of the ecosystem's growth and development, and all of the collaboration potential both in Australia and overseas. That about wraps me up. But yeah, happy to pass back to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Cara. That was a fantastic overview of you know, the Ausagritech Association, and you know what you're doing, what you're seeking to do, and that role in connecting you know, the different parts of the ecosystem together. So thank you very much for that. I might ask, before we open more wide, just one kind of question. So what is the opportunity for, you know, international companies, like we're talking with our ConnectEO folks, you know, to get involved in Ausagritech? Is that something they can do? Should they work with partners to do that? What's your first thoughts on something like that?
There's definitely always potential to connect and collaborate directly. So we do have our Ausagritech ecosystem Slack community, which I'll link in the chat. That's a really great place to start on an informal basis as well. So there's over 900 members in that Slack community. You can just jump in and introduce yourself, you know, sort of share what partnership opportunities you might be looking for. And that's always a really great place to start, which is free and informal. So that's a good start. That link is also on our website as well. We do work with national bodies internationally. So for example, we work with AGRITECH New Zealand at the moment. So if there is a peak body affiliated with AGRITECH, that's something that I'm sure Tracy's probably already in discussions with. But say, for example, in our collaborations with AGRITECH New Zealand, you know, we're hosting member-only events for members of both associations, both virtual and in person. So that's a different way that you can connect. Obviously, that's in New Zealand. There's lots of different other countries as well, and lots of scope in that capacity to connect. And then the other way would just be if you are looking at, you know, what the best way to sort of enter the ecosystem is. There's a lot of organisations like Beanstalk, for example. You can even see on our ecosystem map here. I'll pop that back up. I'll show you the exact spot if it will let me.
This is an unpaid promotion, by the way.
Yeah. So this little section down here, ecosystem builders, has some of them, and that's not all of them. I'm sure there's more on you know, a quick Google search would tell you more. But there's yeah, the opportunities to work with some of these players in the ecosystem to get better acquainted with the best pathways for your particular business, because they do vary depending on the subsector that you sit within in AgTech as well. So there's a couple of different pathways, but I would say informally through Slack, more formally through associations, or just, you know, reach out and send an email to me at marketing@ausagritech.org, and I'm sure I can point you in the right direction of who to connect with, or to go through some of the ecosystem builders in the sector as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cara. That's really informative. We've got time for a few questions now. I'm going to ask one that Mark from Tyrannus asked a little bit a while ago, and I'm not sure exactly who's the best to answer this out of our panelists folks we've still got online. So Cara, Grant, John, are there regulations in Australia for minimising the use of chemical products in agriculture, like nitrogens, for example? Anyone who might have a thought on that? I'm sure. Look forward to any info on that, and I know Mark would be very keen to know more.
I don't think there's actually any sort of regulations for most of the fertilizer applications, apart from possibly some for nitrogen in the sugarcane industries where pollution of the Great Barrier Reef is an issue. But pretty much across the rest of the country, because we have such relatively low rainfall and low nitrogen usage, as for the most part, it's not something that's overly regulated at the moment. But there is growing concern amongst consumers that, you know, governments and regulators should, you know, possibly be looking at it at one point.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Any other questions from the floor at the moment? We've got a few minutes, so now's your opportunity to ask any questions of the big brains that we've got there that are happy to share their information. I note there's Cara's just put in there. Well, there we go. From Mark again. What about the use of water for irrigation? Any comments on that? I'm just wondering, Mark, are you talking about the amounts, the quality, water pollution that might come from that? Feel free to unmic yourself and clarify that one as well, if you like, and the regulation as well around water. Any thoughts on where, I know obviously water is very important. You know, agriculture in Australia is water limited. Any thoughts on those from any of our folks we've got there at the moment?
Others again, if no one else wants to jump in that, most water usage is regulated in Australia. So each year the relative local government authority will assess what their expectations are for the availability of water, whether it's stored in you know, irrigation dams and things like that, and then farmers will typically have a license that limits how much water they can have, but the governments or government regulators each year sort of allocate what proportion of a license a farmer can extract. So a farmer might have a license for 1,000 megalitres of irrigation water. That effectively sets the maximum amount of water they can take each year. And so on an annual basis, the regulator will say, you know, this year's a really dry year, so farmers can only have 50% of their allocation or 20% of their allocation, or in dry years, they might say, no farmers can irrigate this year. So access to water is quite strictly regulated.
Yeah, it's not. And just as an aside, I happened to watch an episode of Landline on the weekend that was all about water management and the role of drones and earth observation and those kind of technologies in starting to manage that even more effectively. So fully agree. It's great. Any other questions at the moment? All right. Well, I might pass over to you, Rosh, just to run us through the next little piece. Oh, no, there we go. Sorry, I just noticed a question from Osman from AgCurate. So I'm curious about the collaboration potential with the Global Digital Farm Project. Have you been collecting yield data in the past, and how, and if so, for how long, and how much do you have? For you, Jonathan.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, there's relatively limited, I think, access to yield data specifically on the Charles Sturt University farm. There's probably 5 or 6 years worth of decent yield data. The year before last, we also added a protein sensor to the equipment. So I've only been in this particular position for a couple of years at the university. So it's a space going forward to look at, but we certainly do have other collaborating farmers where there be many farmers who would actually have up to 20 years worth of yield data. So for organisations that are interested in looking at yield prediction or quality and linking it to remote sensing, there are certainly plenty of growers that we would have access to where we could have really quite extensive yield data layers to add to.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, and Yeah, I like what, as I said before, the Global Digital Farm is doing, and fits in exactly that kind of position you're talking about, I think, Osman. Great. Rosh, so I might pass over to you.
Oh, perfect. So I'm going to run another breakout session now for us to get us all pumping and talking. I have created rooms that have 5 people, and we're each going to have 60 seconds to talk about what the most thought-provoking question that's come out of the collaboration session. So remember, you'll each have 60 seconds, and then we'll all come back into the main room. Here we go. Hello, welcome back, everyone.
Hey.
What was the highlights? Does anyone have any really interesting things that came out of that breakout room for them? Or even any slightly interesting things?
Oh, look, I think there are lots of interesting things. Things that stuck out from our short discussion were around the number of Agtech companies there are and how that's growing, and the importance of, I think, the importance of collaboration to be able to work together to solve the complex problems. That were key bits for me.
Did everybody else have really boring conversations?
We started talking about getting into the nuts and bolts of actually, what does collaboration start to look like? Let's have some conversations and make it happen. So it's been a great conversation so far.
Great.
I confirm, yes. Thank you.
We also discussed collaboration, didn't land any solutions other than noting that there's quite different business models appearing. I've actually chatted to Brendan as well, I think, about this briefly today. And it'll be interesting to see what's a short-term win versus medium and long-term. Is the business model of companies that are going all elbows and pushing everyone out of the way and saying we're going to do the lot and own the entire industry, or is it going to be collaboration between multiple small ones? And if it is collaboration between multiple small ones, when do you start to see some consolidation? Because it's certainly great that there's so many groups out there, but at some point there will be some degree of consolidation. And what would that look like? I think will be a really interesting perspective going forward. And I'd have zero answers to that other than that's what I'm seeing, and I don't know what I'll let the future tell.
Sometimes that's the best thing, though, to make those observations and think about and notice that this stuff is happening. We don't need to have all the answers necessarily. Oh, fantastic. Right. It's great to hear. Brendan, back over to you.
Yeah, well, we might throw back to Rob Waterworth just to talk a bit more about that. We're moving into a session now. We talked a bit about industry. We talked a bit about opportunities for collaboration. And this is getting down to some of the technical detail. I mean, agriculture works in a space of environment. It works in a space of landscape. And we're talking about bringing technology to that. And so there are, this next session about environment technology has got a number of three different groups, companies from Australia that are working in slightly different yet related areas, but doing some really interesting things in areas that I think are fundamentally important to the development of the agricultural industry. First, we just heard briefly from Rob Waterworth there talking about his thoughts on collaboration. Rob is with a company called the Mullion Group. They're doing a lot of work in environment and definitely in the carbon space. And how do these kind of technologies start to play into that carbon space? And again, not just as a data set, but how do you take this kind of information and turn it into data, into information that's going to help different decisions, particularly in the carbon space. So, Rob, I might pass back to you to tell us more about the Mullion Group, the work you're doing. Really interested here, and I think it'll be interesting to everybody.
There we go. Can everyone see my screen there? Or?
Yep.
Yeah, great. I haven't got too many slides. I just thought I'd tap through a few, but you'll see very quickly, leading on from my previous statement, that I'm very biased towards collaboration because our entire platform basically flows around the need for collaboration with people like Phil and Stu and Jonathon and others. So we're basically a data integration system. So, and I'm sure we've covered all of this and sorry I couldn't join earlier, I've been on kid duty. You know, the need for data across the land sector is growing exponentially. And it's not just because we're trying to make better management decisions, but there's a whole lot of policies and other social pressures that are pouring through. And that's really quite fascinating because it's not just broadening the amount of data required, but the range of reporting that's going to be needed, which is bringing more and more companies into the space as they realise that they actually touch the land sector in lots of different ways. The challenge, I guess, that we're seeing as we come across this is, as we know, everything across the land sector is pretty integrated. So there's a large number of issues that need to be addressed. You could actually do about 50 slides on issues, but we sort of break them down into 3 key areas. First one being sort of around what responsibilities you're going to have, be that from markets, be that from form of regulation or legislation around all your greenhouse gas emissions. What the opportunities are there, though, of course, with new markets, but also in particular, I think the big problem is the barriers, especially across agricultural and farmers, around what are the cost benefits, software fatigue in particular. People are sick of more apps, all of those sorts of problems. So you need a solution that's going to solve all of those issues. When I'm talking about what we do, I think the key thing to remember, especially for carbon, but it comes across a lot of areas, is you can only do so much with every single tool that's available. So when you're trying to do these things, you can't do everything with remote sensing, you can't do everything with models, you can't do everything with GIS, you can't do everything with ground data. So the challenge then comes as to how do you integrate them in a sensible way. And if you start to integrate all of those data in a coherent manner, then you can actually start meeting all of these things. And that's really where we work in Flint Pro. It's that integration piece. And we can argue the toss on what's high and low in this table. The carbon, for example, is probably more medium to high now these days from remote sensing with JEDI, but a number of them will still be lower. The other problem that we've seen a lot of, I guess, in our space is that there's lots of data, lots of tools, in particular lots of Excel tools, but very few information and systems. And again, this is something that Phil's been dealing with a lot with some of his stuff that I'm sure he'll present. How do you develop systems that actually give people access to this data rather than just download another spreadsheet, realize it's really complicated, and then have a highly unscalable process? So this is where Flint Pro sits. The idea is that it is actually a system, not a tool. Sorry, I'll go back. Yep. So it's an online software as a service system, or with all the user-specific accounts and all of those sorts of things. But it's designed to integrate all of these data sources that I was talking about before. Puts it all in one place. You can run different models in different places all around the world, so that you basically have a global framework for running. And in particular, does a whole lot of other things like doing scenario analysis and projections. So that it's not just a matter of saying, well, here's what our emissions are and here's what could happen. It's multiple scenarios driving forward. So that comes to my key point, which hopefully will come out here, and I've said a few times before, is that we really build on existing data. We don't make new data as such. So we go to others for the remote sensing data. This is very global forest focused at the moment, that you can see here. But in Australia, obviously, CEVO Labs is a key provider here. Then there's all the GIS systems and the models, but they integrate to provide that data. The system itself, without going into too much detail, looks like this. It's always good to have a lovely flow diagram with pretty pictures on it. But realistically, where we sit is all of these middle parts here. So there's all of the inputs that come in from the outside. We have a data management system here. There's a long story, but that allows us to do full data provenance tracking, so that when you have a set of reports, you can always go back and determine how those were developed, which is going to be important for auditing and systems in the future. But realistically, the nuts and bolts of the system is this middle part, which is an integration engine which takes information. It runs very detailed models for every single pixel through a landscape to produce estimates of soil carbon, nitrous oxide emissions, forest carbon, all of that, using different types of models. And I can always go into that a bit more as people like. Produces very, very large data outputs that then can get summarized up. The thing that's missing here is we also have APIs coming out of the back of the system now as well. And the idea there being is that our interface is very focused at corporates, so groups that have got lots of different pieces of land all around the world and need to have portfolio management of those. But for individual farmers or others, we use other people's systems to deliver that data. And so again, Phil's My Farm Key, we deliver carbon data through that because Phil's done all that interface, and there's no point in us trying to replicate that interface and data management. Obviously, it's more than just an interface. So a couple of quick examples for you to see of what we've been building. This is from a system called the Agricultural Stewardship Program that allows farmers to look at entering the carbon market in Australia with small scale plantings, small scale here being 5 to 200 hectares. And the issue here was that used to be very, very difficult to do. So we teamed up with the Australian National University and built out these tools that allowed farmers to simply draw polygons on maps. And the system would then go through, determine whether the land was eligible, determine based on criteria, and using remote sensing data in this case to say, was it forest or not forest? How long had it not been forest? Therefore, is it eligible to meet the carbon market standards for reforestation, for example? Do all of those calculations, calculate the carbon stocks, and then spit out numbers. And so that took a process that typically took days and brought it down to sort of 20 to 30 seconds. Really nice, simple tool. The interface was actually built by someone else. So again, this is one of those examples of an API coming into a system rather than actually using our interfaces, but all the back-end processing engines and data with this. We're currently doing a lot of stuff with farm emissions. We're really building out tools around scope 1 and 3 emissions profiles. So we've got, along with benchmarking between farms, so you can see, checking farms emissions levels between farms, but also looking at regional benchmarks for comparison. So this is something that we're doing where we're partnering with CSIRO here to take their models and data and integrate them into our systems. And again, we don't see this as us developing necessarily interfaces for this. This is much more where you hook into existing applications so that farmers are basically getting this information alongside all of the other information they're collecting for their day-to-day use. We've got an enteric fermentation model for those that are interested in that. That's all sitting there, spatially referenced, not spatially explicit. So it says we have to know how many head of livestock, for example, are in an area for that to work. But that's another similar thing. So you can start being able to report your entire farm emissions in one place. And then when you start getting into these carbon projects, the large scale ones in Australia. So this is the Emissions Reduction Fund. For those that don't know, that's sort of Australia's semi-carbon market, reverse auction market at the moment. But given our election, who knows where that's going to go in the near future. It's definitely going somewhere good. How good will be the question. And this is where you can start using the system, start looking at past carbon stocks to produce baselines and drive those forwards in projections as to what would happen if you allow those areas to reforest. Again, more remote sensing integration. So this is an example where we ran all of the forests for all of New South Wales. So New South Wales is not a small area. I'm not sure exactly what to compare it to in Europe, but it's enormous. And this was looking at the projections of forests through all time. So what are the impacts of fire? What are the impacts of harvest? What are the impacts of replanting and plantations to look across the landscape so you can start looking at the growth models going forward. And this is a really key piece of information for state governments, but also for carbon project developers so they can start doing some prospecting. And then the final piece that I think is going to be really interesting coming forward, and it'll be interesting for other people's views, is we're starting to see this. It probably should have happened years ago, but it's starting to happen. There used to be this silo of risk, this silo of insurance, this silo of mitigation, and all of those are starting to break down because you're realizing that on a farm, you've got all of these things. You've got risk, you've got adaptation, you've got mitigation actions. All of those things are coming together. And so needing to be able to run those things at once rather than just saying, we'll do this tool for this and this tool for this. The moment you do those multiple tool things, then you'll always end up with inconsistencies, and that's going to start hurting in the future. So what we've been doing here is very simply just taking existing climate risk maps and integrating those in with the carbon mitigation and carbon stock information that we're pulling from the remote sensing and the models, which then allows us to start assessing not just what the carbon stocks are, what they may be, but also what's the risk of those carbon stocks going forward, potentially in this case from fire, so increasing fire risk in these areas. I've been partnering with another small company called Clim Systems on that. So that was just a quick run through of what we're doing. I thought I'd leave some time for some quick questions, and hopefully my kids screaming in the background hasn't been too loud. So I'll go there.
Great, thanks, Rob. No, kid noises are fine. They're at acceptable levels, so don't worry about that.
Excellent.
No, look, I really like this. It's really interesting bringing that spatial element to what the emissions reduction fund and those other things I've been thinking about for a while, but not doing, as you said. Open the floor to any questions for Rob. I'll ask another question in lieu of other ones. So how do you find, like, I think Phil Teakle put in there, so that kind of scale of 1 million square kilometres, how do you find that dealing with that challenges of scale, like like that, and how does that play off against cost benefit and accuracy and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit different for us in many ways, because a lot of the time we are a bit of a garbage in, garbage out model, because we're using other people's data. And so we operate at all sorts of scales. So if a group's looking to do something really simple, like we just need to know if we're going a little bit better or a little bit worse, then you can probably go and use a lot of the global data sets, IPCC defaults, if you're overseas, and a global forest watch. The data's not great, but it's probably going to point you in the right direction. The challenge then comes is that you can then start adding more and more to that. So if you start saying, well, now I'm interested in carbon credits, well, when we're working overseas, for example, we will often disconnect the global forest watch data, and we'll work with space intelligence, for example, out of Edinburgh, and plug that data on, gives you a far more accurate estimate. And the stuff here in Australia, obviously, with Phil, where we're disconnecting simple models of pasture mass and starting to look at how would you stick on the remote sensing of pasture mass. It's spatially explicit, it's far more accurate. You'd be silly not to use it. So that's the first part on the accuracy. The scalability is something we've really focused on from day one. So we've been quite lucky with that. So we have run the entire globe, all the world's forests at 25 meters over sort of a 40-year period. The challenge comes when you start getting, it's less about coverage. It's when you were starting to say, okay, well, now we'll go to 10 by 10 meter pixels or something like that with a Sentinel based product, and then start moving to daily time steps. So it's actually the temporal length of the models that start to drive our costs up, because obviously if you go from an annual model down to daily model, you're running the thing through 365 more times on its steps. So that starts to punch the results up. But that's really more just how much CPU do you throw at it. So.
Cool, thanks, Rob. Any other questions for Rob at the moment?
I can have one.
Here you go, Osman. Yeah.
Hello, Rob. I'm interested in your experience with, with the regenerative transformation in agriculture. I didn't get. Maybe you told it, but I didn't get it. What was your stage? And are you working with farmers already, or which kind of farmers? And especially, what is the challenge when bringing them to, when convincing them to switch to regenerative farming, from your experience?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. Jonathon and Phil and others are probably much better placed than me to talk about a lot of that. But from the technical side, I think that the challenge at the moment in Australia is that a lot of the stories being told aren't necessarily clear or necessarily accurate. So obviously a lot of the regenerative focus is coming in around soils at the moment. Soils are definitely an opportunity. How big that opportunity is a really interesting discussion that I think is going forward. There's some pretty wild numbers being thrown around. So I think there's going to be an issue of trust going forward, and what those numbers will look like. And the no-till arguments around that are probably a good example. 20 years ago, everyone was saying no-till would make a massive difference, and it hasn't made that much of a difference across Australia. Cover crops probably have a bit more of an influence depending on what's happening. It's a bit complicated. So I think from our side, that's that's probably the bigger challenge. In terms of running any models and doing data like that, we're always able to do that. It's just a matter of whether the models are appropriately calibrated and able to give sensible results. And to me, that's going to be an ongoing challenge. And it's again with the stuff we're working with Jonathon and Phil, with AACO, and we're working with others overseas on how do you start to build more confidence around the results from those. I don't know, Phil, if you've got any thoughts there, but it's a pretty interesting piece. It's taking off in the grazing sector in particular.
What about the row crops? I mean, do you see a high interest from arable crops, or is it more like forestry, a little bit agroforestry and so on?
I'd say it's rapidly growing in row crops, would probably be the thing. Forestry has been a big focus for years because it's a bit easier in some ways, and the market's very comfortable with it. But the last 2 years in particular, and with the development of new soil carbon methods for Australia starting to come online, then I think you'll start to see that take off much, much more.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks for that discussion. Thanks for those questions, Osman. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. We might move on to our next presenter. I'm going to introduce Stu Adam from Agronomeye, and what's really a slightly different but related tack to what we were just talking about with Rob Waterworth and the Flint Pro there. This is, Agronomeye guys are really looking. We can talk about these kind of measurements being made. The question is then, how do they start to fit into the operational farm environment? What information do you need at that digital farm level to really start to integrate all this information into farm operations? So understanding the operation of the farm, understanding the financials of the farm, and starting to bring all these kind of data sets into an operational model that's digitally based of farming enterprises. I hope that description is fair enough there, Stu, but please feel free to correct any mistakes I've made, and look forward to your presentation about the work that you guys are doing.
No worries. Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I will share my screen, and I'm not going to go through any slide deck. I am just going to give a demo of our platform in action. Let me just set this up a little bit. So can you guys see, Brendan, can you see the map moving here?
Yep, looking good.
And I'll kind of talk to this. I think this is probably the best way to go about demonstrating what we do and describing why we do it. So yeah, as Brendan mentioned, at Agronomeye, what we are going after is the detail at a farm scale that enables farmers to make decisions with clarity and confidence, and also engage in some of the programs and opportunities like Rob described there. At a smaller farm scale, some of the limitations, like Rob mentioned, again, rubbish in, rubbish out. So how can we start to get detail at a farm scale that enables any landowner to, like I said, make decisions that are relevant to their landscape, but also open up opportunities around other areas of the business as they evolve. So what I mean there is we are really creating a digital twin for agriculture, and the data that we're generating is basically defined as a digital asset, a digital version of the real asset that can be used for many different things, one of which can be, running analysis across the landscape that I'll show you in a second, or it can be used as the base layer to start to integrate other data sets from, say, satellites or soil sensors to get a more integrated dynamic view of the farm. And it's also a great communication tool. So while it can do many, many things, the core of it is the detail at a farm scale. And I'll show you this in an example that we have as a project that we did with Microsoft and CSIRO here in Australia. And then I'll show you how this kind of scales out, because it's important to get after bigger areas. So I'll walk through it right now. So look, when we talk about detail, we mean detail, right? So satellite imagery and satellite data sets certainly have their place. There is somewhat of a ceiling of limitation for that data given the resolution, and what we're trying to fill in is that void kind of below the satellite imagery that enables us to do many things and create more context for other data sets too. So if you think of it through that lens, and what I'm going to show you here is what we've defined as a digital foundation. So the core layers that need to be generated to enable the digital twin. And what I'm going to show you and how you see this technology, that digital foundation, is fed through our Ag Twin platform. And that'll make sense as I walk through this. So I'll just like to show this as an example. We're talking about very high resolution data sets. We get detail throughout canopies of trees, and visually it's obviously pretty obvious when I talk about detail. That enables us to create detailed data sets around the landscape as well, and present them back in very kind of visually appealing ways. So you can see here that there is a dam in the distance there. At the top of the road, you can sort of see how the landscape drops away as well. So you can understand the detail in the landscape, and I'll expose some of that in a second as well. That really is the base data layer that enables us to start to look at detailed classifications or digitizations of farming systems. And we need that high resolution data set to be survey grade, so we can start to put in a survey grade classification of the whole asset. So when I say that, I mean, I can click on anywhere here and I'll click on a tree. It's told me it's a tree. There's some details in terms of height, area and height for that particular tree. It's inside a management area and it's next to a fence, right? So anywhere I click on the farm, it will just tell me here, paddocks 4A, and there's some detail and drop down. You can kind of interact with all of that. From there, I can go into the infrastructure. I already have buildings, but let's look at fences, for example, 36 fences, 26.49 kilometres of fence. There's this detail that needs to be generated at a farm scale. So all of the other technologies can flow, and there is this kind of single source of truth classification for the whole farm, or the fixed asset, and all the environmental or crop asset, or sorry, paddock assets as well. So talking about paddocks, I can go across and have a look at a paddock set here. Here are all the paddocks with the boundaries. These boundaries are used to call satellite imagery at the field scale. If there was, I know on this farm, they've used them for defining drones to go and do spot spraying or smaller paddock spraying. So that use of that data set, many times is very valuable. So that foundational piece comes into play.
Excuse me, Stu, look, we're understanding the same, your opening image there. I'm not sure whether
others have
the same problem as me.
Oh, that's a shame. Let me reshare then. Sorry, thank you.
Not getting the full effect.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you're saying much. Can you see the paddock boundaries there?
There we go.
Yeah, you can see the boundaries now.
Okay. So was that not moving at all the whole time? Was that just a static image?
It was a static image, yeah.
Okay. Well, going back to that, I'll just quickly share with you the detail. Again, I can go in and show you the visual representation. You can see the 3D environment. I can then go and click on a tree, and it will tell me that it is a tree with an ID with specific metrics inside or next to fences and inside management areas. I had walked through this before, but I'll do it again because that would make more sense. So you can sort of see here, I can share data. We're in all different parts of Australia and Europe, and using this tool, we can get a really clear kind of communication, collaboration opportunity, talking about the various elements of the farm. And then I can turn on, I can go to the infrastructure here. As I mentioned, I clicked on fences. There's 36 of them, just under 26.5 kilometres worth of fence line. If I go to trees, for example, 3,015 trees, just that level of detail that we're capturing and capturing it at a survey grade level means that this data has many use cases going forward. Again, I'll turn on the paddocks. We haven't got anything hooked up to this particular property, but in terms of creating that digital filing cabinet, if you will, for that particular paddock, when it comes to usage, whether that's manual input or through API, yield analysis of a header or satellite imagery that can be fed through into the platform as well through API. And I'll show you an example of some soil data that's flowing through this property as well. The reason and the first reason we went after this detail was to enable us to do, as I mentioned before, that farm scale analysis, which is really critical to understanding the unique opportunities for any given landscape. So if I zoom in here and I turn on a water flow prediction layer, and we've been working with CSIRO here in Australia, you can start to view how water moves across the landscape. So these lines that run through the middle of this part of the farm show the higher volume or high collection points within the farm. And you can see that particular flow line there runs between two dams and goes into a natural waterway. How does that help a farmer in terms of defining the most efficient place for dam catchments, but making sure that it's within compliance so the farmer can be ensure that they are compliant at all times, and using the data and the tool that sits in behind all of this to share that information as well. You've got things like water logging as the inverse of that, so you can understand where water moves. An example here is where the water is running straight past the dam and potentially contributing to waterlogging when there's high rainfall events. Is a farmer able to knock a contour in here and capture some of that water, or better manage that water that means it doesn't have a negative impact on the property? Basically creating these fundamental improvements to the landscape, and that's the view that Agronomeye has taken by capturing this data. Again, not a silver bullet, and what we are doing as well is working on top of things like this water flow model to attach pesticide runoff movements to determine where a landowner should or should not put pesticides down. There are things like shade models and wind models that we are developing as well to determine where there would be frost risk or animal welfare concerns when there's cold temperatures and high winds in areas of New South Wales or Victoria, for example, as well. So this is how this data set can be used many, many times. What I'll show you now is where it becomes interesting for the idea around collaboration and how this data can be the base plate or one of the opportunities to build in that context. So I'll turn off the water. It's not on. And then I'll turn on the sensors. So this was, as I mentioned, CSIRO's research farm here in New South Wales. A lot of sensor data being captured here. I can click on any one of these sensors and it will show me what the available water in the soil is doing across a time period. Fair bit of rain in Australia recently, so a fair profile. If I go to the start of 2020, which is when the drought broke, you can start to see now how we've pulled in weather data. So these bar charts here indicate rainfall, and then the sensor recordings at every depth through the profile, enabling us to look at, how did the soil and the profile respond to rainfall events at the start of 2020 and how much rain actually needed to fall before we started to see a response within the landscape. And then what is the difference in that response at the upper levels of the profile through to the lower depths as well. That's great. No farmer is really going to click on all 37 sensors and come up with an insight. So what we've been able to do here, and think of this as just an example of whether it's ground sense data or remote sense data from satellite imagery or even drones or whatever the data set that is available, putting into the spatial context of the farm is very important. So those sensors were generating maps that indicate soil moisture. There's about 3,500 maps that are generated every year for this particular analysis type. And I can go through and bring up a timeline that enables me to view those data layers in a quick view approach. So if I go back to the start of the year before the drought broke, there was zero soil moisture, and you can see these red maps are a pretty clear indicator of that. And as I move throughout the year into March, you see the top depths start to respond. And then when I get to May, you start to see a pretty material response to some higher rainfall events, 37 mils on top of previous rainfall events and a much higher year-to-date rainfall. So creating that context to understand and create meaning for more data sets. I can then click on 2 out of, say, 3,500 that make sense to me or that mean something to me. And then I can start to click between those 2 data layers and see what the variability was at those different depths. There was a carbon layer as well. I'd like to show this as an example, a static carbon layer that was generated by the CSIRO soils team. And what I'm going to do is put the soil moisture on the left and the soil carbon on the right. There's almost there is an inverse reaction here between a relationship here between soil moisture and soil carbon, as represented by the darker green and the darker blue. Somewhat counterintuitive, but if I then turn on again, that digital foundation exposes the ability to turn on the water layer and see that in the context of these 2 data sets, and you can see that the relationship between soil moisture and the actual landscape is very, very defined and very, very clear. So that is the driver for soil moisture in this instance rather than soil carbon. So enabling that extra layer of detail to expose insights that may or may not have been available otherwise. That's really a fly through of the digital foundation and ag twin to start to enable some of those data sets to make more sense and start to open up the lens for collaboration and the detail to expose unique insights. What we've been able to do is create this at a bit more scale. So that was a small sort of 400 hectare farm. It's important to be able to do this at scale. So this is 2 million hectares of high value grazing country in New South Wales. If I turn this on, you can see I'm currently in Sydney. So a good chunk of land. And if I zoom in, you can start to see just the detail that we have at scale. This was taken at the end of the drought. As you can see, there's a pretty sorry looking landscape. Again, the detail that we have at scale and the ability to deliver that data that's very chunky in very practical ways is important. And then that opens us up to look at opportunities around, say, water flow analysis at a large scale that then can be made available as a digital asset to the farmer, and then exposing them to ways to explore that data back through this platform, and then integrate other data streams to enable them to start to click on different analysis layers at different times for different purposes, as well as open up discussions and collaborations with different stakeholders, from banks to insurers to natural capital providers, and talking to people like Rob and the guys at Mullion. How do we enable farmers at this scale to start to use really detailed, high resolution, reliable, vegetation data sets to drive accuracy into existing models, because high quality data in results in a high quality output. So that's really what we're doing at Agronomeye, and our view is absolutely this is not a silver bullet, but a critical layer of information that needs to be exposed and then obviously leveraged to find more and more insights and open more and more opportunities around day-to-day agronomic decisions and management decisions, all the way through to exposing opportunity around natural capital and the newer markets that are presenting themselves into the ag sector as well. So as a bit of a fly through, sorry for the clunky start, but that's what we've built here at Agronomeye and how we sort of see it playing a particular role in the ag sector.
Fantastic, thanks, Stu. And you just summarised it there, like a critical layer of information is really what you're building up there with the digital infrastructure, and how all these things kind of come together, I think is really kind of interesting. Is there any questions for Stu at the moment? We've got time for a couple. I'll ask one just while we're in lieu of others, and while we're thinking about this kind of thing. So what do you see as the important layers of information to start bringing into this? We're looking at some of the Earth observation bits at the moment. Are there particular data sets out of Earth observation? And I'm just thinking, we're looking at multispectral there. Is it is the radar important? Is if we head towards LiDAR, are they all interacting in a way, or you're utilizing those in producing your 3D kind of topography and things?
Yeah, we're using the particular data layers that we require to create the 3D topography. I'll share my screen now just to give you an insight on the detail that we're capturing when we fly over these properties. Can you see that layer there? Yep. Colourful image. That's a 70,000 hectare property, and that's a cross section of just a small area related to the vegetation. It is very important for us to access satellite imagery because that's the more dynamic view of the farm, right? And the landscape. We're not saying that this is something that you should fly every day. So there needs to be this clear benchmark, and then this integration of other data set streams, whether it is a NDVI image all the way through to more detailed radar analysis, in-ground sensors. It all comes together to make complete the picture. Our view and what we've built and what we're finding from the market as well is it's just this underlying infrastructure layer that doesn't exist necessarily, that can then be utilized to create that context for other data sets to make more sense. Soil data as well is critical. I know Jonathon's done a lot of work in that space, and how does that kind of layer into water flow models, into elevation slope aspects, to give us a clearer picture of the landscape. I think you're on mute there, Brendan.
Almost got away with it. Yeah, that's a really great description. That provides that that dynamic inputs into the model, into what you're putting together. Fantastic. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Stu. If there's no other questions, we might move on and get Phil Well, there you go. There's a question there. Which of your data sources is a question that?
Yeah, we start with LiDAR data, as I showed you there in that image, that enables us to do things like understand the vegetation profile across the landscape, so we can look at biodiversity models and analysis. And then from there, it's about building on top of those data layers, or that core data layer. So we start with LiDAR, that's important to us, and then open up the discussion from there.
Great, thanks, Stu. Yeah, from which kind of satellites?
We're actually running manned aircraft across large areas of the country.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Lots of data to process and get into that high resolution stuff. Cool. Thank you, Stu. Then we might have a couple of opportunities for questions at the end. I'm going to pass now over to Phil Teakle to talk about SIBO Labs. One of the interesting things I think around the work that they're doing is, we touched on it there when Stu showed starting to get to the the size of areas that people are starting to look at. Some of the work that Phil Teakle has been doing is really looking at how can we cost effectively start to use Earth observation across the big scales of Australia. So if we start to think about pastoral regions, there's big areas there. How do we do this processing and provide this information that people are after it in a cost-effective way, because processing costs can mount up pretty quickly. So I know he's done a lot of work in that. That might not be exactly the topic he'll be talking about tonight, but yeah, really interested to hear more, Phil, and please tell us about the things you're doing, because that idea of scale, as well as the quality of the information that you're providing, is a really outstanding piece of the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you. Can you share my video here? I was just telling me that I need to. You can't see my head at the moment. I'm just going to share my screen. You see my screen okay? You can't see my my wolf head, but you can see my screen.
We can see, yeah, we can see the images now.
Okay, all right. But thanks for your time tonight. What I might do here is just I won't go into movie mode because I want to flick between sort of a PowerPoint as well as a live demo, like Stu showed you there. SIBO Labs, we were born in 2018. Dr. Peter Scarth and myself set up SIBO Labs in 2018, the two of us, and since then we've grown to a business of about 10 people. I suppose my job is to surround myself with some really smart people. So we've got a wonderful team now of data scientists, remote sensors, extension people, and database people, really building out quite a comprehensive sort of range of capabilities. Where we sort of started, I'm just going to flick here. Where we started basically was really focusing on delivering solutions to individual property owners, and to do that basically, I suppose initially with the corporate cattle companies as a sort of as a key focus, that were typically running million hectare, 2 million hectare, 5 million hectare operations over largely sort of northern Australia. And to deliver some solutions around monitoring things like how many kilograms or how many tonnes of pasture biomass do we have, how many grazing days do I have left, what are my ground cover levels, how's my land condition changing over time, and more recently sort of focusing on things to do with carbon. But really it was basically about how we were going to take some quite complex data and then drive that into some simple decision making basically on farm. Now, since then, I suppose over the last 4 years, because we're focusing on that farm scale and then the ability to scale up to the nation, it's actually led us into a whole range of areas. I'm not going to be able to touch on all of these in detail today, but I'm going to focus on the sort of the paddock and farm level monitoring, and then show you how we're getting up to sort of the national scale. But really, we're doing work directly for individual farms. We're currently monitoring 60 million hectares of largely livestock properties around Australia, or farms around Australia, 60 million hectares of individual paddock or field data basically being delivered every week. And from there, we're then driving information into national services. We're working with industry reporting, so we've been able to scale that information to be able to seamlessly derive information for every single farm in Australia, and to then push that into secure industry reporting frameworks so it can work up and down through the supply chain. We're doing work with farm benchmarking and property reporting. Again, being able to work effectively through those supply chains. So we found ourselves working with processors, with retailers, with banks, basically, and the producers themselves to be able to benchmark their farms and the impact that they're having on natural capital and productivity. And then we're doing a lot of work around integration as well, where we're actually bringing together a range of solutions with other service providers to make that solution easy for producers. And at the R&D end, basically Rob Waterworth mentioned briefly, a major partnership with Australia's largest and oldest cattle company. I think actually the world's largest cattle company, 6.5 million hectares, 400,000 head of cattle, investing very, very heavily in a whole of landscape carbon approach. But very importantly, we're getting the carbon hype at the moment. It's actually not about the carbon. It's actually about better land management. And yes, there might be some carbon sales made in here, but really it's about more sustainable, more productive, more profitable landscapes. And if we can actually make a few bucks out of the carbon, that's great. But it's actually not about the selling the carbon markets. Ultimately, it's about improved landscape management. So in terms of the solutions that we're sort of driving onto the farms, our key product or our key service is called Pasture Key. You can go on our website and have a look at this. But really, I'm going to show you some details here in a minute and show you an example. But really, it's about driving that complex image processing systems on the left-hand side there, where we've got enormous data sets now available to us, and thanks to programs like Digital Earth Australia, the work that Frontier SI have done with the DEA Labs program, Sentinel Hub and others, obviously NASA's in there as well, making these enormous data sets and these time series data sets available to then allow industry to drive basically sort of benefits out of that has been core to it. But really it's then basically about getting that data from getting field data collected, and as a small company, we've had a major data collection program. I think we've probably got more pasture biomass data than any government agency in Australia now, or any research agency, where we're collecting field data basically with individual producers, and that's really required to drive these machine learning models. And we see time and time again, there's these words around drones and machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's actually not about the sensors themselves. Ultimately, it's actually about what we can do in terms of collecting the data on the ground and integrating that with the sensors that we have available, and how we do that in a sensible way through these machine learning and artificial intelligence tools. And really at the right-hand side of that is how do we take all that complexity and deliver it to a solution that changes the management decision basically on a farm. And really that's actually about the data that we collect on the ground. So we've been talking a lot about the sort of remote sensing here. We have an enormous investment in basically field data collection systems, where we've got now upwards of 6,000 sites. We provide our clients, basically, and consultants with dedicated data collection apps to basically collect data in the field, and then we're continuously scraping those data sets and basically bringing those data sets together in a unified way, and then delivering data products basically with our remote sensing. So as an example here, we've got our typical Pasture Key service. What you're looking at there is a 5-daily Sentinel estimate of kilos of dry matter per hectare. And you can see there the numbers on the map there, upwards of 3,500 kilos and above, and we're actually getting over 5,000 and over 6,000 kilograms of dry matter predictions out of our service. And that's because we actually don't use NDVI. We have people have been really wed to NDVI and simple greenness indices. We actually don't use NDVI directly at all. We actually use a full multispectral approach and derive a whole range of biophysical indices and attributes basically from that imagery to then drive the biomass predictions through our extensive field data. But once we've done that, we then need to integrate with other services. So we've actually got systems like AgroWeb in here, where we actually take our data and we push that data directly from our system into AgroWeb, and that actually then informs information on, integrates with information on the livestock herd information, animal class data, feed demand in terms of the animal class and the mob data, and then our system then calculates basically the available grazing days based on that mob data. So we're actually able to integrate the remote sensing, derive products out of that remote sensing in terms of kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and then push that directly into feed calculators. We also are working with other companies, a range of companies there, And whether it be companies like Pear Tree that can then push that data into dashboards where it gets integrated with water sensor data from FarmBot, data from Agronomeye, data from basically from other service providers, come together into a dashboard system, basically in companies like Pear Tree, whether it be Maya Grazing or AgriWeb or others, bringing those sources of data together into a single view for farms, or it could be basically spreadsheets that basically people are, still obviously using spreadsheets for all this data as well. So we've got to be able to push those web services and be able to push that data basically out through our systems into these other platforms. And then I suppose a really good example of that is our work with Ceres tags, where we're taking our predictions of pasture biomass on a 5-daily basis, integrating that with animal movement data directly from direct to satellite ear tags with Ceres tags, and generating enormous insights in terms of pasture utilisation across paddocks. It's not just about the animal alerts, and yes, we can do that, but from our perspective, it's actually how we integrate that demand side in terms of the animals themselves and where they're moving in the landscape on a daily basis with that information on pasture biomass, and starting to unpack things around pasture quality, for example. We might have a lot of biomass, we might have poor quality. So what can we do around supplements and other things that we can then drive the utilisation of those paddocks to improve our basic production outcomes. And then other examples where we're taking data from companies like Mullion Group. So Rob just talked about Flint Pro. We draw that data basically from Flint Pro into a system. We can do rapid benchmarking of any farm in Australia in terms of its long-term trends in tree cover change, in ground cover, in pasture biomass production, and also carbon stores and carbon movement. And that data is being pulled directly from the Flint Pro model. So really creating a channel for commoditising those sort of data products and pushing them out into simple products that a user can pay with their credit card. So this is the Farm Key app. So what I thought I might do now is just quickly give you an example of how we're going about that in terms of sort of a live demo. So our client base here at the moment, we've got about 60 million hectares. You can see here we've got sort of a lot of the northern cattle producers, and we're gradually building out a client base in the sort of the southern farming systems. I'm going to click on one of those. This is our typical service that we provide to individual producers. There's the 5-daily Sentinel data. We also do cloud detection and cloud masking. That's a simple natural colour image that we provide in there. We run a model called fractional cover, so it's actually giving us information on the photosynthetically active component, the bare component, and the non-green component of those pastures and trees as a signal initially into things like pasture quality, so we can start to look at how areas are haying off, what areas are frost affected, what areas are bare ground, and we can basically track that through time. From a regulatory perspective, we are able to monitor ground cover going over these large areas at paddock scales, where we've got regulatory requirements for ground cover management. And I suppose here's a good example here where we've got NDVI, and we pretty much only use NDVI here to show people how limited it is. So this is an image here with NDVI, and if we compare that to our fractional cover image, it's absolutely like chalk and cheese there. So that simple greenness image from NDVI is not giving us the same sort of information with the multispectral data does. So what we then do is turn that through our machine learning models. We're able to then calculate kilograms of dry matter per hectare. You can also see in here that we've dealt with the trees. So if I just toggle this on and off, you can see the tree areas through here. So we also map and estimate the density of the woody vegetation cover, the persistent cover, and then we moderate that model again through our ground data collection to basically to pull that biomass actually down under the trees typically. Although in the season like now, where we're not water limited, quite often there's actually a lot of pasture going into those trees, but that's only because of the current season. And then we can click on any paddock here, and I can basically get an estimate of the kilos of dry matter per hectare at the paddock level. You can see here over 2,500 kilos, and as I said, we're getting up into 5 and 6 and even 8,000 kilograms of dry matter in some places. And then that information there actually goes straight through into AgriWeb or other feed calculators or pasture calculators to drive basically the estimate of the grazing days per hectare. So that's basically at the farm scale. I thought, okay, right, if we can do it at the farm scale, let's do it nationally. So we've developed using Lambda processing systems we're processing around 7,000 Sentinel seeds a week. And in a partnership with Meat and Livestock Australia, we're now delivering these services, or soon to be delivering these services. And it's going to be launched in the next 3 months to every levy-paying red meat producer in Australia. And as I zoom in here, you can see here it's sharpening up. So this is the lambda processing engine. It's basically processing data with different resolutions as I zoom in. And you can see here we've got the entire basically Sentinel archive accessible here. I can look at the landscape in 2017. And I can look at it basically effectively last week. And we've just done that for the whole country. There's 7,000 satellite scenes basically being processed to deliver that. And I can then bring in our estimates of pasture biomass over the top of that. And I can zoom in here. You can see these areas here are over 5,000 kilos. And I can then put basically our cadastral log data over the top of that. So here's every land parcel in Australia we have access to. And I can click on any one of those land parcels in here. And there's basically a graph showing the last basically 5 years of Sentinel data for basically for every land parcel. So that's basically being built into tools to provide industry. In this case here, we've got data on a rolling 5-day time step and a rolling 30-day window in terms of estimates of kilos of dry matter per hectare for every land parcel in Australia, to then be able to benchmark those sort of properties on. So there's an example here. We can then scale that up to basically to a whole state basically monitoring system here. And if I tap on this region just here, I've now got that individual pasture data aggregated to a regional level, and we can look at changes in ground cover in terms of the proportion of those areas that are achieving ground cover levels. We can look at our pasture biomass, and we can also then look at this region relative to previous seasons. So if I click on any one of these areas here, we can then look at the current season relative to the seasons gone past in terms of what the biomass levels are. So if I go down here and click on this one here, which is sort of the yellow area around Alice Springs, you can see here the very large rainfall that occurred earlier this year, and then the tapering off of that pasture biomass. So we've basically got the ability now to pretty much scale from the paddock to the nation every week using these Sentinel data sets. I might leave it there, given that we're running out of time, Brendan.
Great, thanks, Phil. And as I mentioned at the start of your presentation, that as you summarised at the end there, the ability to go from paddock scale to national scale, at will, I think is really powerful. And then combining with that new indices, going to that biophysical based industry, so beyond NDVI to those other biophysical descriptions of the landscape, really powerful. We've got a couple of minutes left. Are there any questions from the folks that we have in the audience?
Yes, I have one.
There you go, Mark. Thank you.
No, thank you for this presentation. Very impressive. Just a question: what is the economic model which is behind it? Is it do you have subscription mechanisms for the farmers, or how do you sell the services in this case?
Yeah. So it's a bit hard. I can't show my video there. I know, Roshni, if you can maybe let me share my video there, so I can. So I'm not in. There we go. Hopefully you can see me now. So in terms of our typical services, we're a subscription service based on a hectare basis for individual properties. So, for example, a property less than 3,000 hectares, the annual subscription for that on a 5 daily service is about $1,000 a year. And scaling up, obviously, we've got many clients that have got million hectare plus properties that we provide information to as well. So we scale on that per hectare basis. The model I showed you, basically in terms of the national service, that's an industry service that we're providing for free for red meat levy paying producers in partnership with Meat and Livestock Australia. It's a $5 million investment, and over the next sort of 4 years, of which our company is basically co-funding that. So we're funding half of that, and on the basis that basically we believe that those industry-wide services that will allow us to basically engage with the supply chain are then going to allow us to then draw people into a sort of a premium model where they'll see value in our paddock level services, and there'll be a proportion of those producers pay for those subscription services. So it's a bit of a mixed model. But I think the big thing here is that it's no longer a tech company dealing with just a farmer. It's actually a collaboration of tech companies that work together to deliver a solution to a farm or to a business, and then to engage with the supply chain. So we're in a world now where, whether it be production values or natural capital values, we have to have the ability to engage with those supply chains. So the people that we're collaborating with are not just the farmers, but then effectively it's the processors, it's the meat packers, it's the retailers that actually want this information as well. And how do you do that in a safe and secure environment, and trust and deal with the privacy issues, and also be producer centric? How do you actually work up and down through the supply chain and ensure that the farmer is the primary beneficiary of that information? It's not the bank first, it's the farmer first.
Okay, then thank you. Thank you for the clear answer.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Mark. Thank you, Phil, for the presentation and the answers there. I know we've just gone over time. I'm going to pass back to Rosh, and she can close us out. Thanks, Rosh.
Hello, everyone. Well, we really hope that you have enjoyed the session, that you've gotten many gems of wisdom, many things to think about, and that it's giving you questions to ponder, potential collaborations to set up. If you would like to connect with anyone who has been part of our speaking list today, please do reach out to me. I'm sure that you'll all have my email by now. I've been sending many emails, or Brendan, who I'm sure that you're all familiar with. We would love to support you to connect with each other, and I hope you've had a really good time. So thank you again for making the time to join us, and we really appreciate it. We look forward to hopefully seeing you in a week's time, next Monday, 9 AM Brussels time, for the final day 3 of our trade mission for Australia with ConnectEO. And thank you very much to everybody.